At 11:47 on a Tuesday night, I stood on my own front porch in Charleston and watched my mother's phone shatter on the brick because of 4 words I said through an intercom she didn't know I'd installed. 6 weeks earlier, while I was 3,000 miles away in Singapore closing out a 9-figure fraud audit, my parents forged my signature on a deed and sold the house I paid $415,000 for in cash, so my little brother could have a wedding with a raw bar and a string quartet. If you're watching this from a city where somebody you trusted once used your name without asking, type it in the comments right now. Then hit like and subscribe, because by the end of this video, you're going to want to know exactly how a forensic accountant dismantles her own family. There were 3 things I didn't know yet, standing in the doorway of the Singapore serviced apartment with my suitcase half packed. I didn't know that the deed transfer on my house had already been notarized 9 days earlier by a woman named Carol Pruitt, who had known my mother since they were 19 years old and pledged the same sorority at the University of South Carolina. I didn't know that my brother Derek's fiancée, a 26-year-old event planner named Brittany Hale, had already picked out a 5-carat cushion cut and told her bridal party the ring was an investment piece, obviously, paid for out of money that used to be equity in my walls. And I didn't know that in 11 weeks, standing under string lights at the Harborview Country Club with 200 guests watching, I would be the one to make sure every single person in that room understood exactly what my family had done, while a man with a badge stood behind me holding a folder with my name on it. The financial thread started with a wire alert. My bank sends me a text for anything over $5,000 moving out of any account with my name attached, a habit I picked up after 11 years doing forensic fraud examination for a firm that specializes in unwinding embezzlement schemes for mid-size manufacturing companies. On a Thursday afternoon, Singapore time, while I was reviewing purchase orders for a client who'd lost $2.3 million to a procurement manager with a gambling problem, my phone buzzed with a notification that didn't belong to any account I remembered opening. Home Title Escrow Services, $402,000. I stared at it for 11 full seconds before I understood I wasn't looking at fraud committed against a stranger. I was looking at fraud committed against me, using my own name, by people who had known my social security number since the day I was born. The personal thread started 9 months before that, at Thanksgiving, when my mother Linda pulled me into the kitchen with the turkey half carved and told me, in the particular bright voice she uses when she's already decided something and just needs me to agree to it, that Derek and Brittany were thinking about doing something special for the wedding, and wouldn't it be wonderful if the whole family pitched in the way families do? I said, carefully, that I supported them however I could within reason, and my mother's smile had gone thin and brittle in a way I recognized from childhood, the smile she wore right before she decided a conversation was over because it wasn't going her way. I didn't know yet that pitching in the way families do was, to my mother, a euphemism she had already applied, in her own mind, to a house that had my name on the deed and nobody else's. The third thread, the one about vengeance, didn't start until the night my mother's phone hit the ground, but the seeds of it were older than that. Older than Derek's engagement, older than my divorce 3 years earlier, when I'd used every dollar of my settlement to buy that house outright, so nobody could ever again put their name on something that was mine, and pretend they had a say in what happened to it. The seeds were in every year of my childhood, where my accomplishments were treated as background noise, and Derek's mediocrity was treated as a miracle that needed constant, expensive celebration. I am 34 years old. My name is Vanessa Cole. I have spent my entire career finding the exact moment where a trusted person decided the rules didn't apply to them, and on a Thursday afternoon in Singapore, I realized I was about to spend the next 2 months doing that to my own mother. I flew home 4 days later, on a red-eye I booked without telling anyone, because 11 years of forensic work teaches you one thing above every other lesson. The moment a suspect knows you're onto them, the evidence starts disappearing. If my mother had known I was coming, if Derek had known, if that notary named Carol Pruitt had known, records would have vanished, alibis would have been rehearsed, and I would have spent the next year fighting a version of events polished smooth by people who had 11 days head start on me. Instead, I landed at Charleston International at 6:52 in the morning, took a cab straight to the County Register of Deeds office instead of going home, and requested a copy of the current deed on file for 214 Ashcroft Lane, a 2-story brick Georgian with a wraparound porch and a magnolia tree I had planted myself the spring after my divorce was finalized. The clerk, a heavy-set man named Purnell, who'd clearly seen every kind of family catastrophe walk through his door, slid the printout across the counter without much ceremony. I read the top line 3 times before it fully landed. Grantor, Vanessa Marie Cole. Grantee, Home Title Escrow Services, as agent for Gary and Linda Cole, subsequently transferred to Derek and Brittany Hale Cole via quitclaim, recorded 11 days prior. My own signature sat at the bottom of the deed transfer, in blue ink, in a hand that was close enough to fool a notary who'd known my mother for 3 decades and hadn't looked twice, but not close enough to fool a woman who had spent the last decade of her professional life staring at forged signatures for a living. My M curved the wrong direction. My C closed at the wrong angle. Someone had practiced my name from an old birthday card, maybe, or a check I'd written years ago and left lying around the house during a visit. It didn't matter where they'd copied it from. It mattered that it wasn't mine, and I could prove it wasn't mine in about 4 minutes with equipment sitting in a drawer in my own office. I didn't go to the house. I didn't call my mother. I did what I do professionally, which is build a case before I ever say a word to the person I'm building it against. Because the single most dangerous thing you can do to a fraud investigation is tip off the subject before your documentation is airtight. I called a name I hadn't dialed in 4 years. Ruth Delaney, my mother's older sister, a retired federal prosecutor who had spent 19 years in the Eastern District of Virginia, putting away white-collar criminals before she retired to open a small forensic law practice, specializing in exactly the kind of case I now realized I was standing in the middle of. Ruth and my mother hadn't spoken since a property dispute over their own mother's estate almost a decade earlier, a dispute in which, tellingly, my mother had also tried to manufacture a signature on a document, and Ruth had been the one to catch it then too. Ruth answered on the second ring, and when I told her what I'd just read on a deed printout in a county clerk's office, there was a silence on the line I will never forget. 4 full seconds of nothing, and then she said, in the flat, controlled voice I would come to rely on for the next 11 weeks, "Don't call your mother, don't call your brother. Come to my office in an hour and bring every document you have." Ruth's office was on the 2nd floor of a converted cotton warehouse near the Charleston waterfront, all exposed brick and steel beams, and when I walked in carrying a manila folder with the deed printout and screenshots of the wire alert, she was already on the phone with someone at the county recorder's office, using the particular register of voice I remembered from childhood holidays, the one that made grown men on the other end of a phone line sit up straighter. She hung up, looked at me for a long moment, and said the thing that would become the engine of everything that followed. "Your mother has done this before. Not to you, to me." And I let it go, because I didn't want to fight with my own sister over property that, frankly, I didn't need. You are not going to make that same mistake, because this isn't a $400,000 house to your family. This is a $400,000 house that used to be a marriage, and a divorce, and 11 years of you working 80-hour weeks while your brother lived rent-free in their basement until he was 26. If you let this go, they will do it again, to something bigger, and next time you might not catch it in time. I need to explain who I actually am before I explain what happened next, because none of it makes sense without understanding the family I grew up inside. My father, Gary Cole, spent 31 years as a regional sales manager for an industrial fastener company, a solid, unremarkable career that provided a comfortable, unremarkable life, and somewhere in his 50s he developed the particular disease of men who peaked quietly and never noticed. An absolute conviction that his family's comfort was owed to them by the universe, regardless of who was actually generating the money that produced it. My mother, Linda, had not worked outside the home since Derek was born, and she had built an entire identity around being the kind of woman other women in her book club admired. A woman whose children were doing so well, a phrase she used constantly and applied almost exclusively to Derek, who had, at that point in his life, held 4 jobs in 6 years and left every single one of them convinced the failure belonged to somebody else. I was the accident of ambition in that family, the daughter who got a full scholarship to the College of Charleston, who worked 2 jobs through undergrad, who got hired by a boutique forensic accounting firm straight out of a master's program at Georgetown, and made partner track by 29. My mother's reaction to every promotion, every raise, every case I closed that got written up in an industry newsletter was some version of the same sentence. "That's nice, honey, but you know your brother's really finding himself right now." I spent years telling myself that was fine, that success didn't need external validation, that I didn't need my mother to understand what a forensic fraud examiner actually did for a client roster that included 2 Fortune 500 subsidiaries. I told myself that until the night my own signature showed up on a deed I never signed, at which point I understood, finally and completely, that my mother had never stopped keeping score. She had simply been keeping it in my brother's favor the entire time, and now she had decided the ledger could be balanced with my house. My marriage had ended 3 years earlier, quietly and without much drama, to a man named Marcus Fenn who I'd met in business school, and who turned out, over 6 years, to want a wife who worked normal hours and hosted dinner parties more than he wanted a partner who flew to Singapore for 6-week audit engagements. The divorce was amicable in the legal sense and lonely in every other sense, and the $415,000 I walked away with, my half of a townhouse we'd sold in the divorce, plus a small inheritance from my paternal grandmother, went entirely into 214 Ashcroft Lane, purchased in cash, in my name only, 6 months after the divorce was final. I planted the magnolia tree the following spring, on a Saturday morning with dirt under my fingernails and a playlist of nothing but Nina Simone, and I remember standing back to look at it and thinking, for the first time in years, that I had built something that was entirely, unambiguously mine. Nobody could take it in a settlement. Nobody could put their name on it without my knowledge. I genuinely believed that, right up until a wire alert on a Thursday afternoon in Singapore told me I was wrong. Derek's engagement to Brittany Hale happened fast, 8 months from first date to ring, and from the outside it looked like the kind of whirlwind romance people write greeting cards about. From the inside, once I started paying real attention, it looked like two people who had each individually decided the other one represented an upgrade in social currency. Brittany worked as an event coordinator for a boutique planning firm that specialized in weddings north of $80,000, and she had, according to a conversation Ruth's investigator would later reconstruct from a bridal party group chat, told her closest friends within 2 weeks of the engagement that she intended for her wedding to be, in her words, a portfolio piece, something she could put on the planning firm's own website as an example of her taste. Derek, for his part, had been unemployed for the 7 months prior to the engagement, having left his most recent position as an account manager at a regional insurance brokerage after what he described to the family as a difference in vision with leadership, and what his former manager, when Ruth's investigator eventually called him under the pretext of an employment verification, described as being let go for missing 11 client meetings in a single quarter. I want to be precise about something here, because precision is the entire discipline I've built my career on. I did not begrudge my brother his happiness. I did not begrudge Brittany her taste, or her ambition, or even her 5-carat ring, which, as it turned out, had been purchased on a store credit line co-signed, without my knowledge, by my father. What I begrudged, what turned cold and hard and permanent in my chest over the following 11 weeks, was the specific decision, made by two people who had raised me and were supposed to know better, to solve their son's wedding budget problem by committing a felony against their daughter. There is a version of this story where my parents ask me for help and I say no, and we have a difficult, awkward family conversation about boundaries and money, and everyone goes to therapy, and the wedding happens on a smaller budget, and nobody breaks any laws. That version of the story was available to my parents at every single point along the way. They chose forgery instead, and once you understand why they chose it, the rest of what I did stops looking like vengeance and starts looking like the only rational response available to a woman whose own mother decided her signature was a resource to be harvested, rather than a legal instrument that belonged to another human being. Sitting in Ruth's office that first afternoon, jet-lagged and running on airport coffee, I laid out everything I had. The deed printout with the forged signature, the wire alert, a screenshot of a text my mother had sent me 8 weeks earlier, while I was still in Singapore, that read, in its entirety, "Don't worry about anything for the wedding, sweetie. Daddy and I have it handled." A sentence that had seemed like ordinary parental reassurance at the time, and now read like a confession written in advance. Ruth spread it all across her conference table and started asking the questions that would define the entire investigation. Who notarized the deed? What escrow company processed the sale? Where did the $402,000 go after it left escrow? And, the question that would eventually break the case wide open, who else knew and when did they know it? Notaries have to keep a journal, Ruth said, tapping the printout where Carol Pruitt's notary stamp sat beside my forged signature. Every state requires it. Name of signer, type of ID presented, thumbprint in some states, date and time. If Carol Pruitt notarized a signature for a woman who was, provably, on a different continent at the time, either she never checked ID at all, which is notary malpractice and grounds for losing her commission, or she checked an ID that wasn't yours, which starts to look a lot more like she knew exactly what she was doing. Ruth had already pulled South Carolina's notary regulations up on her second monitor before I'd finished my coffee. Carol Pruitt, it turned out, had held her notary commission for 11 years, had never had a complaint filed against her, and had known my mother since they were sorority sisters at USC, a detail that told us everything about motive and nothing yet about proof. Over the following 4 days, while I told my parents I was still finishing up loose ends in Singapore and wouldn't be back for another 2 weeks, Ruth's investigator, a soft-spoken former SLED agent named Walter Bishop who'd spent 20 years working financial crimes for the state, began quietly building the paper trail. He requested, through a formal public records request that wouldn't raise any flags because it looked like routine title research, the full escrow file from Home Title Escrow Services, the company that had processed the sale. He pulled Carol Pruitt's notary journal, which, under South Carolina law, was a public record any citizen could request to inspect. He ran a property history on 214 Ashcroft Lane, going back to the original purchase, establishing an unbroken paper trail showing me as sole owner from the day of purchase to the day of the fraudulent transfer. Each piece, on its own, was mundane. Together, they were building towards something that would eventually sit on a prosecutor's desk with my name on the complaint and my mother's name on the defendant line. The notary journal arrived on a Tuesday morning as a scanned PDF, 41 pages of Carol Pruitt's careful cursive documenting 11 years of notarized signatures, and Walter Bishop found the entry in under 6 minutes because he knew exactly what date to look for. There it was, line 14, from the bottom of page 38. Vanessa M. Cole, quitclaim deed, ID presented, South Carolina driver's license, number ending in 4471. I have never in my life owned a South Carolina driver's license ending in that number. I have held a Georgia license since I was 17 years old, back when my family briefly lived in Savannah, and I renewed it by mail every 8 years because I traveled too much for work to bother switching states. The number Carol Pruitt had written into her official notary journal, the number she was legally required to verify against a physical ID in front of her, belonged to nobody, or belonged to a document that didn't exist, or, and this was the possibility that made Ruth go very quiet and very still when she read it, belonged to a fake ID somebody had specifically created to complete the fraud. Walter Bishop pulled a thread that ran, over the following 10 days, straight to a print shop 40 minutes outside Charleston in a strip mall off Highway 17, a place that did laminated ID cards for college students who wanted a backup form of identification and asked no questions about age or legitimacy as long as cash changed hands. The owner, when Walter visited under the pretext of a routine business license inspection paired with a few casual questions, remembered nothing specific, which was expected and unhelpful, but the shop's security camera footage, which Walter requested and the owner handed over without realizing its significance, still existed on a 30-day rolling backup. On it, time-stamped 9 days before the deed transfer, was a woman in a floral blouse I recognized instantly because I had bought it for my mother 2 Christmases earlier at a boutique on King Street. She was standing at the counter with a printed photograph in her hand, feeding information to a bored 22-year-old clerk who typed it into a laminating template without once looking up to ask why a 59-year-old woman needed a fake driver's license in her daughter's name. I watched that footage sitting beside Ruth in her office, and I want to describe honestly what I felt, because it wasn't the grief or shock a person might expect. It was something colder and more clarifying, an almost clinical recognition that snapped the entire architecture of my childhood into a new, more accurate shape. This wasn't an impulsive mistake made under financial pressure. This was premeditated identity fraud, planned across multiple steps and multiple days, requiring my mother to source a photograph of me, likely lifted from an old family photo she'd had scanned, or a picture off my own social media, drive 40 minutes to a print shop that specifically catered to fake IDs, pay cash so there'd be no card trail, and then carry that fabricated document into a notary's office run by her own sorority sister, all before ever picking up the phone to ask me a single question about whether I would help pay for my brother's wedding. The house wasn't a last resort. The house was the plan from the beginning, and every conversation she'd had with me about families pitching in had been theater, designed to establish a narrative of my supposed reluctance in case anyone ever asked why she hadn't simply requested my consent. I flew back to Charleston not 2 weeks later as I'd told my parents, but 11 days after landing the first time, having spent the intervening time helping Ruth and Walter build the rest of the case while staying at a hotel 40 minutes from my parents' house, under a corporate rate I billed to a consulting engagement that didn't technically require my physical presence. During those 11 days, I learned the full shape of the financial fraud, and it went deeper than the house alone. The $402,000 from the escrow sale had moved through my parents' joint checking account for exactly 31 hours before being split 3 ways. $280,000 wired directly to the Harborview Country Club as a deposit and progress payment for Derek and Brittany's wedding. $61,000 transferred to a jeweler on King Street, identified on the wire memo simply as Ring DC, and the remaining $61,000 kept in the joint account, where, over the following 6 weeks, it slowly bled out in withdrawals my mother made at ATMs near a day spa she frequented, and a furniture showroom where, Walter's record search would later confirm, she had placed a deposit on a full living room set she described to her book club as, "finally updating the house we've been meaning to for years." My father's role in all of this deserves its own accounting, because for most of my life I had filed him mentally under passive, a man who went along with my mother's decisions because disagreeing with her required more energy than he was willing to spend. The evidence Walter uncovered complicated that story in a way I found, if anything, more disturbing than active malice would have been. My father hadn't forged anything himself. He hadn't driven to the print shop or lied to a notary. But bank records showed he'd been the one to physically deliver the fraudulent deed to Home Title Escrow Services, sitting across from an escrow officer named Priya Nandi and confirming, verbally, on a recorded intake call Walter subpoenaed weeks later during the formal investigation, that yes, this was his daughter's signature, yes, she had authorized the sale, yes, she simply couldn't be present because of work travel and had signed the documents before leaving the country. My father lied to a stranger's face, on a recorded line, to help liquidate his daughter's house, and then went home and ate dinner with my mother, as though nothing unusual had happened that day. The secondary antagonists in this story, my aunt on my father's side, Marjorie Cole Bennett, and Derek's fiancée, Brittany, each revealed themselves through smaller, uglier moments that accumulated over those 11 days the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river, individually unremarkable, collectively damning. Marjorie had been widowed for 6 years and lived 2 streets over from my parents in the same subdivision, and her defining trait, the one I'd watched her display at every family gathering since I was a child, was a bottomless entitlement to other people's resources dressed up as familial closeness. When I called her, still gathering background before confronting anyone directly, using the cover story that I was helping plan a surprise contribution to the wedding, she told me, without a hint of self-awareness, that she'd already spoken to my mother about staying at my old room, at 214 Ashcroft Lane, for a week during the wedding festivities, since Derek and Brittany's new place, purchased with wedding money that hadn't technically closed escrow yet, wouldn't be ready for guests. She was making plans to occupy a house that had been stolen from me before the theft had even been publicly acknowledged, casually assuming access to space and comfort that had never once been offered to her, because in Marjorie's worldview, family resources existed to be claimed by whoever asked loudest and most persistently. Brittany's opportunism showed up differently, more calculated, more aware of its own strategy. In the bridal party group chat that Walter's investigator eventually obtained through a cooperating bridesmaid, a young woman named Ashley Kirkendall, who worked with Brittany at the planning firm and had grown increasingly uncomfortable with what she was witnessing, Brittany had written, 3 weeks before the wedding, Derek's mom found a way to cover the rest of the venue deposit. I stopped asking questions TBH. I just need this day to be perfect, and if I ask too many questions, it becomes my problem. She knew, not the specifics, not the forgery, not the fake ID, but she knew enough to understand that asking further questions might implicate her in something she didn't want to be implicated in, and she made the deliberate choice to look away, because the alternative was jeopardizing a wedding she'd already described to her professional network as a portfolio piece. That message, more than almost anything else in the case file, told me who Brittany actually was underneath the soft-focus Instagram captions about finding her person, someone who would accept stolen money as long as the theft stayed comfortably abstract. I decided, on day 9 of the investigation, that I needed one more thing before I moved toward any confrontation. I needed to see my family behave normally, without knowing I was watching, so that later, when they inevitably tried to rewrite the story of what happened, I would have my own clear memory of exactly who they were in the moment before they knew they'd been caught. So on a Sunday evening, I did something I hadn't planned when this all started. I drove to my parents' house unannounced, told them I'd landed early and wanted to surprise everyone, and sat through a family dinner watching 4 people I loved or had once loved or was trying to figure out whether I still loved perform their ordinary selves while sitting 3 feet from a stack of documents in my car that would end at least 2 of their lives as they currently understood them. My mother answered the door already mid-sentence, the way she always did, pulling me into a hug that smelled like the same rose perfume she'd worn my entire life while saying, "Vanessa, you didn't tell me you were coming. Oh my gosh, Gary. Look who's here." I would have made the good roast. And I let myself be pulled into the front hall of a house I had grown up in, decorated in the beige and sage palette my mother had maintained since a renovation in 2011, and I smiled and said I'd wanted to surprise them, which was true in a sense my mother could not yet appreciate. Derek was already there, sprawled on the sectional with his laptop open to a spreadsheet of seating charts, and Brittany sat beside him scrolling through a Pinterest board of centerpiece arrangements on her phone, occasionally reading options aloud in a voice pitched for an audience. Okay, so we could do the ranunculus and eucalyptus combo, or we could go bolder with the dahlias. What do you think, babe? I mean, it's an investment either way. People remember centerpieces. Dinner was pot roast, the same recipe my mother had made every Sunday of my childhood, and the conversation orbited entirely around the wedding, as it had for the better part of a year, my mother narrating logistics with the breathless enthusiasm of a woman producing a small Broadway show. My father nodding along and occasionally contributing a dollar figure. The florist quote came in at 11,000, but Linda talked them down, with the flat, accounting clerk affect of a man reciting numbers he'd stopped questioning long ago. At one point my mother turned to me and said brightly, "You'll come to the venue walkthrough on Thursday, won't you? Harborview is just gorgeous. Wait until you see the ballroom, it's going to be the wedding of the year." And I said yes, of course, thinking about the fact that I already knew, because Walter had pulled the wire records, that Harborview's deposit had been paid in a lump sum of $280,000, drawn from the sale of my house 9 days before this conversation. The moment that crystallized everything, the moment I would replay for the rest of my life as the precise instant I stopped feeling any obligation towards softening what was coming, arrived over dessert. My mother, cutting into a store-bought pecan pie, said to the table in general, "You know, it really all worked out perfectly. The timing on the house sale and everything. I keep telling your father it was practically divine intervention." And my father chuckled and said, "Divine intervention with a 6% commission." And Brittany laughed. And Derek said, without looking up from his laptop, "Yeah, Mom, seriously, you guys are the best. I don't know what we would have done." And nobody, not one single person at that table, said my name. Nobody said the word Vanessa in connection with the house that had, 4 weeks earlier, still had my name on the deed and my magnolia tree in the front yard. They spoke about it the way people speak about an inheritance or a lottery win, a stroke of impersonal good fortune that had simply arrived, rather than an asset they had stolen from a specific, present, currently eating pot roast at their table human being. I drove back to my hotel that night and called Ruth at 10:40 p.m., and I told her I was done watching and ready to move, and she said the thing that shaped the entire final phase of the plan. We're not confronting them piecemeal. We're not doing a quiet family conversation where your mother cries and reframes this as a misunderstanding, and your father disappears into the garage. You have documentary proof of felony forgery, felony fraud, and a fabricated government ID. This isn't a family dispute anymore, Vanessa. It's a criminal case, and the only version of this that actually protects you, legally and financially, is one where law enforcement is already involved before you say a single word to your mother's face. Everything else just gives them time to destroy evidence or build a sympathetic story before anyone official is looking. The following morning, Ruth walked the full case file into the Charleston County Sheriff's Office Financial Crimes Unit, where a detective named Ray Odom, a heavy-set man in his 50s with 22 years on the force and a specific, personal disdain for elder-on-younger family fraud cases because his own grandmother had been financially exploited by a cousin years earlier, spent 3 hours going through the notary journal, the print shop footage, the escrow recordings, and the wire transfer records, before looking up and saying, "According to Ruth's account of the meeting, I've seen a lot of family fraud in this job. This is one of the cleanest paper trails I've ever been handed. Your niece did half my job for me." A warrant request went to the solicitor's office that same afternoon, built around 3 charges: forgery of a legal instrument, financial identity fraud, and obtaining property by false pretenses. With my mother named as the primary defendant, my father named as an accessory for his role at the escrow closing, and Carol Pruitt referred separately to the Secretary of State's Notary Commission Board alongside a parallel criminal referral for notarizing a signature without properly verifying identification, a decision Detective Odom made after reviewing the print shop footage a second time and noting, with visible irritation, that a notary with 11 years of experience doesn't get to plead ignorance when the ID doesn't match a face she's looked at across a dinner table 100 times. It took another 16 days to build toward an arrest that Ruth and Detective Odom both wanted to time deliberately, for reasons that were partly evidentiary and partly, I'll admit now, partly designed with me in the room when they discussed it. An arrest made quietly, at my parents' house on a Tuesday morning, would produce a clean legal record, but no accountability witnessed by anyone who mattered to my mother's carefully curated social identity. My mother had spent 30 years building a reputation in her book club, her church, her sorority alumni chapter, as a woman of taste and generosity and impeccable family values, and Ruth understood, the way only a sister who had watched Linda operate for 6 decades could understand, that the punishment my mother would actually feel, the one that would land somewhere real instead of bouncing off a lifetime of practiced deflection, needed an audience. Detective Odom, for entirely separate professional reasons involving flight risk and the risk of evidence destruction around the remaining fraud proceeds, had already flagged the wedding date itself, 11 days away, as a natural point of maximum financial and logistical exposure. Every dollar of the stolen money would be spent, visible, and impossible to claim had gone anywhere else. And every person who mattered to my mother's reputation would be standing in one room at one time. That is the night I answered the intercom. It happened 9 days before the wedding, not on the porch as they'd expected, but through a small speaker box I'd had a security company install at 214 Ashcroft Lane the week before, at Ruth's suggestion, ostensibly to protect a house that was, per the fraudulent deed, no longer legally mine, but which I had not yet vacated, and did not intend to vacate until a judge told me otherwise. My mother and father showed up unannounced at 11:30 at night, having apparently discovered through Brittany, who'd mentioned in passing that she'd seen my car in the driveway earlier that week, that I was staying at the house rather than a hotel, and my mother's voice came through the intercom, sharp and demanding, in a register I recognized as her cornered voice, the one she used when she sensed control slipping and needed to reassert it immediately. "Vanessa, open this door right now. We need to talk about what's going on with the escrow company calling your father. Some kind of mix-up with a detective, and I swear if you've done something to embarrass this family right before your brother's wedding." I let her finish. I let her get all the way to the end of that sentence, standing on a porch that belonged, on paper, to her son and future daughter-in-law, demanding an explanation from a daughter whose identity she had personally stolen, using a fake driver's license purchased with cash at a strip mall print shop. And then I pressed the button on the intercom and said the 4 words that ended that phase of my life and started the next one. The 4 words that would, 6 weeks later, become the caption under a video that got 11 million views. "I know everything, Mom." My mother's phone, which she'd been holding up to record what she apparently expected to be a triumphant confrontation putting her difficult daughter in her place, slipped out of her hand and hit the brick step hard enough to crack the screen straight across. And through the intercom speaker I heard, with a clarity I will carry for the rest of my life, my father say, very quietly, to my mother, "Linda, what did you do?" They didn't leave the porch that night. My mother stood there for 11 minutes, according to the timestamp on the security camera footage I would later review with something close to detachment, cycling through every tactic I had watched her deploy across 3 decades of family conflict. Outrage, wounded innocence, a sudden pivot to tearful pleading, and finally, when none of it produced a response from a locked door and a silent intercom, a threat delivered in a voice gone cold and flat in a way I'd rarely heard from her. "If you do this, Vanessa, if you actually go through with whatever this is, you will not have a family left when it's over. I hope you understand that." I stood on the other side of that door with my back against the wall and my own phone recording the audio through the intercom app. And I let the silence answer her, because Ruth had coached me on exactly this scenario 2 nights earlier. Say nothing further, document everything, let the solicitor's office and Detective Odom handle the timeline from here. My father, before they finally got back in the car, said one more thing, quieter than my mother's threats, almost to himself but close enough to the intercom that it picked up clearly. I told her this was a bad idea. I told her the second she brought up the print shop. Those 9 words, captured on a recording Detective Odom would later cite in his supplemental report, did more legal damage to my father's claim of ignorance than almost anything else in the entire case file, because they proved, beyond any ambiguity, that he had known about the fake ID before it was ever used. That he had understood exactly what my mother was planning, and that his objection, whatever form it had taken, had not been strong enough to stop him from sitting across an escrow desk 2 weeks later and vouching for a signature he knew belonged to a woman standing on the other side of the world. Marjorie found out through the family group chat the following morning, a chat my mother used to announce, in a message dripping with wounded performance, that Vanessa was going through something and asking everyone to please be patient and give her grace during such an important week for the family. A message that mentioned neither forgery nor deeds nor detectives, only vague, saintly suffering on my mother's part. Marjorie's response, sent 40 minutes later and forwarded to me by a cousin who still had some functioning moral compass left in that extended family, read, "Whatever's going on, I hope it gets resolved before the wedding. This is Derek's moment, and it would be a real shame if drama overshadowed it. Also, Linda, are we still on for me staying at the Ashcroft house the week of? Just need to know so I can plan my flight." 9 days after her nephew's mother had been contacted by a financial crimes detective, Marjorie's only recorded concern was whether her free lodging arrangement remained intact. And I want to be clear that I am not editorializing when I say that. I am quoting a text message that exists, unaltered, in a phone I still own. Brittany's arc during those 9 days moved in the opposite direction, from studied ignorance towards something closer to panic. And it moved there because Ashley Kirkendall, the bridesmaid who'd grown increasingly uneasy with what she was witnessing at the planning firm, finally did what none of my actual blood relatives had managed to do. She asked Brittany, directly, whether she had any concerns about where the wedding money had come from. Brittany's response, forwarded to me weeks later once Ashley decided her loyalty belonged somewhere other than a wedding built on stolen equity, read, in part, "I'm not going to interrogate my future mother-in-law about her finances. That's insane. And honestly, if you keep bringing this up, I'm going to start wondering whose side you're actually on right before my wedding." Brittany had every opportunity, across 9 full days, to ask a single direct question of my brother about where $280,000 had suddenly appeared from, and she chose instead to defend the silence, because the silence was funding a wedding she had already, in writing, called a portfolio piece for her career. Derek, throughout this entire stretch, occupied a strange middle territory, between the parents who had committed the actual crime and the fiancé who had chosen not to ask questions, and I want to give his behavior the specific, unflinching accounting it deserves, rather than the vague, sympathetic, softening families instinctively apply to their most obviously compromised member. Derek was 29 years old, a grown man, unemployed for the 7th consecutive month by the time of the wedding, entirely without an income of his own, and when he learned, because he did learn, 4 days before the wedding, in a phone call from our father that Walter's investigation later reconstructed through cell tower records and a partial voicemail Derek left on our mother's phone, that the venue deposit, the ring, and half the guest list's open bar were funded through crimes committed against his own sister. His recorded response, captured in that voicemail because he'd butt-dialed her while venting to a friend afterward, was not shock, was not horror, was not any recognizable expression of concern for what had been done to me. It was this. This is insane timing. We're 9 days out, there's no way we're canceling now, everyone's already booked flights. Derek's first, and, based on everything Walter's investigation turned up, only recorded reaction to learning that his sister's identity had been stolen and her house sold out from under her was a logistics complaint about guest travel arrangements. If you've made it this far in the video, you already understand something about what it feels like to watch people you trusted reveal, one small selfish sentence at a time, exactly how little your well-being weighed against their own convenience. And if that's ever happened to you, drop a single word in the comments describing how it felt in the moment you realized it, because I read every single one, and hit like and subscribe before we get to the part where all 4 of these people find out, in the same room, at the same time, exactly what 9 days of silence had cost them. The final 9 days moved on 2 parallel tracks that I lived simultaneously, one visible to my family and one entirely hidden from them. Visibly, I attended the venue walkthrough at Harborview my mother had invited me to, standing in a ballroom with soaring windows overlooking the marsh, nodding along as a wedding coordinator named Felicia pointed out where the head table would sit and where the string quartet would set up during cocktail hour. All while knowing that Detective Odom had already obtained bank records showing exactly how much of the $280,000 deposit remained refundable versus already spent. Information that would matter enormously for restitution calculations once charges were filed. I sat through a cake tasting where my mother debated the merits of lemon lavender versus classic vanilla bean, with the seriousness of a woman deciding matters of state. And I ate a bite of each and said the lavender was lovely, and I did not once let my face show that I had spent that same morning on a conference call with Ruth. Detective Odom and an assistant solicitor named Priya Chandrasekaran discussing the precise legal mechanics of executing an arrest warrant at a public event without triggering a false arrest or public disturbance liability claim from Derek's wedding guests. Hidden from my family, the actual case moved forward with the specific, patient momentum of a prosecution built to survive a defense attorney's every attempt to poke holes in it. Detective Odom obtained a second, corroborating handwriting analysis from an independent forensic document examiner named Dr. Wen Huang, who compared my forged signature on the deed against 7 authenticated samples of my actual signature spanning a decade, including mortgage documents from the original 2021 purchase of 214 Ashcroft Lane, and concluded, in a formal report that would become Exhibit 14 in the eventual case file, that the deed signature showed significant and consistent divergence in letterform construction, stroke pressure, and baseline habits inconsistent with genuine authorship by the same writer, a technical way of confirming what I'd known standing in the county clerk's office 3 weeks earlier. My mother, or someone acting at her direction, had forged my name, and an expert witness would say so under oath if this case ever reached trial. Carol Pruitt, the notary, was interviewed separately by Detective Odom on the Thursday before the wedding, and her interview, which Ruth obtained a summary of through the discovery process weeks later, revealed a woman who had convinced herself, through the particular moral flexibility people develop when helping a lifelong friend, that she was doing nothing seriously wrong. She told Odom she'd recognized Linda's daughter from photos, and hadn't scrutinized the ID as closely as she should have, because you don't expect your sorority sister of 30 years to hand you a fraudulent document. When Odom showed her the print shop footage, time-stamped and unambiguous, Carol Pruitt reportedly went silent for nearly a full minute before asking whether she should call a lawyer, a question Odom noted in his report as the moment the interview effectively ended, and a question that told everyone in that room she understood, finally, the actual severity of what she'd participated in. I spent the 7 nights before the wedding at a hotel across town, unable to sleep more than 4 or 5 hours at a stretch, running through every possible way the confrontation at Harborview could unfold, and every possible way it could go wrong. Ruth, who had prosecuted enough cases to know that the gap between a well-built case file and a clean, controlled arrest could be enormous, walked me through contingencies with the same clinical patience she'd have used briefing a junior prosecutor. What if my mother tried to physically stop the arrest? What if Derek attempted to interfere and got charged with obstruction himself, dragging my brother, whatever his failings, into a criminal record he'd carry the rest of his life? What if the wedding guests, 200 people who knew nothing about any of this, filmed the entire thing on their phones, and it ended up online before I had any control over the narrative? That last question turned out to be almost prophetic, though not in the way any of us anticipated, because the video that eventually reached 11 million views wasn't filmed by a guest at all. It was filmed by me. I want to explain that decision honestly because I've thought about it more than almost anything else in this entire story. Somewhere around day 5 of that final week, sitting in Ruth's office reviewing the arrest logistics for what felt like the 40th time, I made the decision to wear a small, legal, single-party consent recording device clipped to the inside of my dress for the wedding, not to create content. Not yet, but because I had learned, across 11 years of forensic work, that people who have spent months constructing a comfortable lie about their own behavior will, when finally confronted, say things in the heat of the moment that no amount of careful documentation beforehand can capture. I wanted my mother's voice, unscripted and unprepared, on the record, in case a defense attorney later tried to claim this had all been some kind of misunderstanding, some innocent muddle over paperwork rather than a calculated felony. South Carolina is a one-party consent state for recording conversations. I only needed my own consent to record what happened, and I gave it freely, understanding fully what I might be capturing. The morning of the wedding, I woke at 6 a.m. in my hotel room and did something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I called my father, alone, without Ruth on the line, without a script, because some small, stubborn part of me needed to give him one final chance to be the man I'd occasionally, across childhood, believed him capable of being. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with a sleeplessness that matched my own. I asked him, directly, whether he understood what today was going to be. There was a long pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then he said, "Your mother thinks if the wedding just happens, if we just get through today, everything will settle down and you'll let it go, because you'd never do something that hurts Derek on his wedding day. She's convinced herself of that. I don't know if I believe it anymore." I asked him one more question. Did he know, When he sat across from Priya Nandi at the escrow closing and confirmed my signature, that it was forged. The silence that followed lasted 6 full seconds, and then he said, quietly, "Yes." I thanked him for his honesty, told him I loved him, which was true even then, in some complicated, grieving way, and hung up the phone knowing I had just obtained, on a recorded line I'd set up for exactly this purpose, my father's explicit admission of knowing participation in the fraud, 4 hours before the wedding began. Harborview Country Club sat on 11 acres overlooking the tidal marsh. Its ballroom walls made almost entirely of glass so that by 6 in the evening, when the ceremony began, the entire wedding party stood bathed in the particular gold light Charleston does better than almost anywhere else in the country. The kind of light that makes even ordinary moments look like something worth photographing. I sat in the 4th row on the bride's side, in a navy dress that hid a small recording device clipped beneath the fabric near my collarbone, and I watched my brother stand at the altar in a rented tuxedo that cost, according to a receipt Walter had pulled during the investigation, $480 for the weekend, waiting for a bride who walked down an aisle strewn with white rose petals, purchased with $280,000 of my stolen equity. I clapped when they kissed. I meant it, in the narrow, specific sense that I have never wished my brother genuine unhappiness, only accountability, and those two things, I had come to understand over the preceding 9 weeks, are not remotely the same thing. The reception moved from cocktail hour into the seated dinner exactly as Felicia, the coordinator, had described during the walkthrough. The string quartet transitioning into a jazz trio, servers circulating with past hors d'oeuvres, my mother working the room in a champagne-colored gown, accepting compliments with the particular glow of a woman who believes she has successfully executed a difficult project. I watched her from across the room, mid-conversation with a table of her book club friends, gesturing expansively toward the chandelier, and I understood, watching her, that she had genuinely convinced herself the danger had passed, that whatever had happened on that porch 9 days earlier had been some temporary daughter's tantrum that the sheer momentum and beauty of the wedding day would sweep away and dissolve. She had no idea that Detective Odom and 2 uniformed officers were parked in an unmarked sedan in the club's overflow lot, timed to enter precisely when the toast concluded and before the cake cutting began, a window Ruth and the assistant solicitor had selected deliberately because it was the moment of maximum audience, maximum sobriety among the guests, and minimum risk of the situation escalating into physical chaos over an open bar that had been running for 4 hours. The best man's toast ran long and forgettable, and then it was my turn, because Derek, in a decision I now understand was Brittany's idea, intended to project a united, harmonious family to her professional network of wedding industry contacts and attendants, had asked me 2 weeks earlier, before any of this had fully surfaced between us, to say a few words as the maid of honor's counterpart on the family side. I had told him yes, weeks before I knew what a house sale actually meant, and I never withdrew that yes, because I understood, somewhere in the calculating part of my mind that had been running this entire operation, that a microphone handed to me voluntarily, in front of 200 witnesses, at the exact moment law enforcement entered the room, was worth more than any confrontation I could have staged myself. I stood, took the microphone from Felicia's outstretched hand, and looked out at a room lit gold by the last of the evening sun coming off the marsh, and I began the way any maid of honor adjacent toast begins, with warmth, with a story about Derek as a kid, about the time he broke his arm falling out of the treehouse in our old backyard, and I was the one who drove him to the emergency room because our parents were at a dinner party and hadn't answered their phones. I let that story land, let the room laugh softly at the image of a 12-year-old Vanessa white-knuckling the wheel of our mother's Volvo, with an 8-year-old Derek crying in the passenger seat, and then I said, I've always been the one who shows up when things go wrong in this family. I want that on the record tonight because it's about to become relevant. I saw my mother's face change first, a small tightening around the eyes that nobody else in that room would have recognized as the beginning of panic, because nobody else in that room had spent 34 years learning to read every micro-expression Linda Cole's face was capable of producing. I continued, 9 weeks ago, while I was working overseas, this family, specifically my mother, with my father's knowledge and direct assistance, forged my signature on the deed to my house, sold it for $402,000, using a fake driver's license my mother purchased at a print shop off Highway 17, and used that money to pay for tonight's venue, this ring, and roughly a third of the open bar you've all been enjoying. The room did not erupt immediately. It did something stranger, something I've watched back on the recording dozens of times since. It went almost perfectly silent, 200 people frozen mid-bite, mid-sip, mid-whisper, in the particular suspended stillness of an audience that has just realized the performance they're watching has stopped being a performance. My mother's champagne-colored gown seemed to drain of color along with her face. Derek half rose from his seat at the head table, saying, "Vanessa, what the hell?" And Brittany's hand shot out to grip his arm, whether to steady him or to physically prevent him from doing something worse. I've never fully determined. And in that exact silence, timed with a precision Ruth and Detective Odom had rehearsed twice over the phone the night before, the ballroom's double doors opened and Detective Ray Odom walked in with two uniformed officers, moving directly toward the head table with the unhurried, procedural calm of a man who had done this 100 times and understood that speed only creates the chaos that lets guilty people run. "Linda Cole," Detective Odom said, his voice carrying easily across a room that had gone dead silent. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of forgery, of illegal instrument, financial identity fraud, and obtaining property by false pretenses." My mother, standing now, her wine glass still somehow in her hand, said the words that would become, along with my four through the intercom, the second half of the callback that closed the entire narrative loop of this story. "This is insane. I don't know what she's told you. She's always been jealous of her brother. Ask anyone in this family." And Detective Odom, reading her rights in the flat procedural cadence officers use precisely because emotion has no place in that moment, cut cleanly through her sentence the way my silence had once cut through hers on the porch. My father did not resist when a second officer approached him with a separate warrant, naming him as an accessory. He simply stood, set his napkin down with a strange, almost domestic care, as though folding it neatly mattered more than anything else happening in that moment, and said, quietly enough that only the officer and the recording device near me picked it up clearly, "I'm sorry, Vanessa." I should have stopped her the first day. Carol Pruitt, seated at a table near the back reserved for family friends, stood up on her own before anyone approached her, walked to where a third officer waited near the ballroom's side entrance, and said, audibly enough that several nearby guests would later describe it to a local news reporter who picked up the story within 48 hours, "I know why you're here. I've been waiting for this call for 2 weeks." Her notary commission was suspended by the Secretary of State's office the following business day, pending a formal hearing, and she would eventually plead guilty to a reduced charge of notary misconduct in exchange for testimony against my mother, a decision that made the eventual case against Linda Cole close to unassailable. Brittany's reaction in the immediate aftermath told me everything I needed to know about the future of that marriage. She did not go to Derek's side as officers led our parents toward the ballroom's side exit. She stood, smoothed the front of her wedding gown with both hands in a gesture so mechanical it looked almost like a reflex, and said, to the room in general but to no one in particular, in a voice gone brittle and high, "Okay, well, I think we should probably still cut the cake. The photographer's only booked until 9. In the video that eventually circulated, that sentence became, among the 11 million people who watched it, the single most quoted line, clipped and captioned and set to ironic music on platforms I hadn't even known existed until strangers started tagging me in it. Because it captured, in 9 words, exactly the kind of person who could watch her fiancé's parents get arrested for defrauding his sister and worry, in the same breath, about photography scheduling. The video I recorded that night sat untouched on my phone for 3 weeks after the wedding, because in the immediate aftermath I had far more urgent things demanding my attention than content creation. Coordinating with Ruth on the civil side of reclaiming title to 214 Ashcroft Lane, sitting for 4 separate interviews with Detective Odom and the assistant solicitor as they built the criminal case toward formal indictment, and fielding a genuinely staggering volume of calls from extended family members who had, within days, split cleanly into 2 camps. Those who reached out to ask if I was okay, and those who reached out to ask if there was any way to walk this back before it destroys the family. A phrase I heard so many times across those 3 weeks that it started to lose meaning entirely. I want to be honest that I did not, in that window, feel triumphant. I felt exhausted in a way that went past physical tiredness into something closer to grief, because even a family that had defrauded me was still, biologically and historically, the only family I had, and watching 2 officers walk my parents out of a country club ballroom in handcuffs did not undo 34 years of birthdays and car rides and Sunday dinners. It simply revealed, with brutal clarity, what those years had actually been worth to the people who'd shared them with me. The criminal case against my mother moved through the South Carolina court system over the following 8 months, and I'm going to walk through exactly how it resolved, Because the specifics matter and because I promised myself, sitting in Ruth's office that first afternoon, that if I ever told this story publicly, I would tell it with the same precision I bring to every fraud case that crosses my professional desk. My mother was formally indicted on 3 felony counts: forgery of a legal instrument, financial identity fraud, and obtaining property by false pretenses, with the total value of the fraud calculated at $402,000, the full sale price of the house. Her attorney, a well-regarded Charleston defense lawyer named Foster Halloway, who typically handled white-collar cases for clients who could afford his hourly rate, attempted, in the early pretrial phase, to argue that this was fundamentally a family financial dispute, better suited to civil court, a strategy Ruth had anticipated almost word for word, and had already preempted by ensuring the criminal referral, filed by Detective Odom rather than by me personally, made clear that the state, not merely an aggrieved daughter, had an independent interest in prosecuting identity fraud and forged government identification, regardless of the family relationship between victim and defendant. The plea negotiations, which began roughly 5 months after the arrest, once Foster Halloway's team had reviewed the full discovery file, including Dr. Wen Huang's handwriting analysis, the print shop security footage, Carol Pruitt's cooperating testimony, and the recorded intercom exchange from the porch, collapsed almost immediately, once it became clear the state's evidence left essentially no room for a defense built on ambiguity or mistaken authorization. My mother ultimately pled guilty to 1 count of forgery of a legal instrument and 1 count of financial identity fraud, with the obtaining property by false pretenses charge dismissed as part of the negotiated agreement in exchange for full restitution and her cooperation in confirming, on the record, the sequence of events that implicated my father as a knowing accessory rather than an unwitting bystander, a confirmation that mattered enormously for how his own case would resolve. She was sentenced to 18 months in a state correctional facility, with the possibility of parole after serving roughly a third of that term for good behavior, along with 5 years of probation following release and a restitution order requiring full repayment of the $402,000, a sum that would functionally consume what remained of my parents' savings, their retirement accounts, and eventually, once those proved insufficient, force the sale of the very house Marjorie had once assumed she'd be staying in for free during wedding week. My father's case resolved differently, reflecting both his more limited role and his cooperation, once the weight of the evidence, including his own recorded admission on the phone call I'd made the morning of the wedding, made any defense strategy built on denial functionally impossible. He pled guilty to a single reduced accessory charge, avoided incarceration through a plea agreement that included 2 years of probation, 600 hours of community service, and joint responsibility for the restitution order alongside my mother. And he lost, as a direct consequence of the felony conviction, the sales manager position he'd held for 31 years, since his employer's compliance policy prohibited employees with fraud-related convictions from remaining in any role involving client financial relationships. At 59 years old, with a felony record and a resume built entirely around a single industry and a single employer, my father found himself functionally unemployable in the career he'd spent his entire adult life building, and the last I heard, filtered through a cousin rather than directly, he'd taken a part-time position stocking shelves at a hardware store 3 nights a week, a job that paid roughly a tenth of what he'd earned as a regional sales manager and that he'd apparently told a former coworker he found, in a phrase that struck me as almost unbearably sad when it reached me, humbling in ways I probably needed. Carol Pruitt's professional consequences arrived faster and more completely than either of my parents. The Secretary of State's office permanently revoked her notary commission within 6 weeks of the wedding, a revocation that, combined with her guilty plea to notary misconduct, effectively ended her 22-year side career as a mobile notary and loan signing agent, work that had supplemented her retirement income by roughly $18,000 a year. More damaging, in a smaller-scale way that I hadn't fully anticipated but that Ruth told me was entirely predictable, was the social fallout within her own circle. The sorority alumni chapter she and my mother had both belonged to for over 3 decades quietly removed her from its executive committee within 2 months, citing, in a vague email obtained later by a mutual acquaintance, conduct inconsistent with chapter values, and several of the friends who'd once filled her social calendar stopped returning her calls entirely, not out of any moral clarity about identity fraud specifically, but out of the simpler, more common instinct people have to distance themselves from scandal before it can attach itself, even peripherally, to their own reputations. Derek and Brittany's marriage did not survive its first year, though it took longer to collapse than I initially expected. held together for a while, I think, by the sheer social momentum of having just had an enormous, widely discussed wedding, and neither party wanting to be the first to admit it had been built on a foundation that couldn't hold. The restitution order attached to my parents' case created a financial reality Derek had never had to face in his life. With our parents' assets frozen and then liquidated toward repayment, the safety net that had funded his last several years of underemployment, quiet parental subsidies for rent, for car payments, for the lifestyle Brittany expected, simply vanished overnight. He took a job, his first steady position in over a year, as a claims processor at an insurance company for $41,000 a year, a fraction of what Brittany had apparently assumed their household income trajectory would look like when she agreed to marry him. And according to Ashley Kirkendall, who I stayed in occasional contact with after her cooperation with the case, Brittany began, within 4 months of the wedding, quietly asking colleagues at the planning firm whether prenups could be retroactively negotiated, a question that told its own story about where her priorities had settled once the champagne-colored glow of the wedding day wore off. They separated 11 months after the wedding, and the divorce, finalized roughly a year after that, left Derek in a one-bedroom apartment 40 minutes from downtown Charleston, working a job he found tedious but stable, and left Brittany, according to the last update I received through the extended family grapevine, having left the planning firm after the wedding's very public unraveling, made her a liability rather than an asset to a business built on discretion and glamour, working now as an assistant coordinator at a much smaller firm handling corporate events rather than weddings, a demotion in both prestige and income that she reportedly attributes, when the subject comes up, entirely to Derek's family rather than to her own choice to accept $280,000 stolen dollars without asking a single hard question. Derek and I have spoken twice since the wedding, both brief, both strained, both ending without resolution, though the second conversation, roughly a year after everything happened, included one sentence from him that I've chosen to hold on to, uncertain what to do with it yet. I think about that voicemail I left Mom a lot. About flights. I hate that that's what I said first. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I have not yet decided whether it changes anything between us, and I've stopped feeling obligated to decide on any particular timeline. Marjorie Cole Bennett's consequences were smaller and honestly almost darkly comic in their proportionality to her role in the story, which was never criminal, only characterologically damning. She lost, obviously, the free week of lodging she'd been angling for, since the house itself became the subject of a civil title dispute, before eventually being sold to satisfy restitution. More significantly for a woman whose entire social identity revolved around being the reliably present, endlessly opinionated hub of extended family gossip, the scandal made her radioactive within her own social circle, for reasons that had nothing to do with legal exposure, and everything to do with the fact that several of her own friends, once they learned the full story, found her documented indifference to her niece's stolen identity, expressed in a text message asking about lodging logistics 40 minutes after learning about a criminal fraud investigation, genuinely repugnant. She wasn't charged with anything. She simply became, within her own neighborhood and church community, the aunt people quietly stopped inviting to things. A social erosion with no formal mechanism and no appeal process. Just a slow withdrawal of the casual warmth she'd spent decades assuming was permanent and unconditional. My own trajectory across that same year moved in almost the exact opposite direction, and I want to describe it honestly, without false modesty, because part of what this entire experience taught me is that the same instinct that made me good at my job, the refusal to accept a comfortable, unverified story when the underlying documents told a different one, was the instinct that ultimately protected me when the people who should have protected me instead. The civil case to reclaim clear title to 214 Ashcroft Lane, run in parallel with the criminal proceedings, resolved within 4 months, once the forged deed was formally voided by court order and the fraudulent quitclaim transfer to Derek and Brittany was unwound, restoring my sole ownership of the property, though by that point I'd made the decision, with Ruth's counsel, not to move back in. I couldn't stand on that porch anymore without hearing my mother's phone crack against the brick, without remembering my father's voice saying, "Linda, what did you do?" So I sold the house myself. This time through a legitimate, properly notarized transaction I oversaw personally from a lawyer's office rather than an escrow desk, and used the proceeds, combined with the restitution payments that began arriving in structured installments over the following 2 years, to buy a smaller, quieter property on Sullivan's Island, close enough to the water that I can hear it at night, far enough from my parents' old neighborhood that I never have to drive past 214 Ashcroft Lane unless I choose to. Professionally, the story that started as a private family catastrophe became, in a turn I never anticipated and initially resisted, a significant unplanned catalyst for my career. When I finally posted the recording, 3 weeks after the wedding, after Ruth reviewed it for anything that might compromise the ongoing criminal case, and confirmed it was clean to release, I did it with a short, unadorned caption explaining what viewers were about to watch, expecting, at most, a modest audience of people who followed true crime and family drama content casually. Instead, it reached 11 million views within 6 weeks, picked up by several larger commentary channels who reacted to it, then by a regional news outlet that ran a follow-up piece once the criminal sentencing became public record, and then, more meaningfully for my actual career, by several small and mid-sized businesses who reached out directly asking whether the forensic accountant in the video did consulting work, because watching someone methodically build an airtight fraud case against her own mother turned out to be, apparently, a remarkably effective demonstration of professional competence. Within 8 months, I'd left my firm to start an independent forensic fraud consultancy, and within 18 months, that consultancy had a client roster 3 times the size of what I'd managed as a senior associate, built almost entirely on the reputation of a woman who does not let people, family, or otherwise, rewrite a paper trail in their own favor. I visited my mother once at the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution roughly 4 months into her sentence, a decision I debated for weeks beforehand and nearly canceled twice on the drive there. I want to describe that visit honestly because it complicates, rather than simplifies, the neat moral arc a story like this tends to want to have. She looked smaller than I remembered, in a way that had nothing to do with actual physical size and everything to do with the absence of the performance she'd worn my entire life. The bright hostess voice, the carefully arranged hair, the constant narration of a life going according to plan. She sat across a metal table from me in a visitation room that smelled like industrial cleaner, and for the first several minutes neither of us said anything at all, and then she said quietly, without the wounded innocence register I'd braced myself to hear, "I used to tell myself I was doing it for Derek." Somewhere in the last 4 months, I've had a lot of time to sit with the fact that I was doing it because I genuinely didn't think you'd ever find out, and if I'm being honest with you, and I owe you that now more than I've ever owed you anything, I don't think I would have stopped if you hadn't. I didn't forgive her in that room. I want to be clear about that because I know people watching this expect a redemption beat, a tearful reconciliation that ties the story into something tidier than the truth actually was. I told her I appreciated her honesty, the same thing I'd told my father months earlier, and I told her that appreciating her honesty and trusting her again were 2 entirely separate processes operating on 2 entirely different timelines, one of which had already started and one of which I couldn't promise would ever fully arrive. She nodded, and something in her face, some last residue of the woman who used to insist every family conflict be resolved on her terms and her schedule, seemed to finally, genuinely accept that this particular conflict was not going to bend to her preferred outcome, no matter how sincerely she apologized 4 months into an 18-month sentence she had, ultimately, chosen for herself the day she walked into that print shop with a photograph of my face. Ashley Kirkendall and I became, unexpectedly, something like friends over the following year, a relationship that started purely transactionally, her cooperation in exchange for nothing but her own conscience, and grew into regular coffee meetings where she'd tell me, with a kind of relieved candor, how relieved she'd been to finally have somewhere to put the discomfort she'd been carrying for months before the wedding, watching a colleague she genuinely liked build a professional milestone on a foundation she suspected was rotten, and not knowing what, if anything, she was obligated to do about it. She left the wedding planning industry entirely about 8 months after everything happened, went back to school for a paralegal certificate, and told me once, over coffee near the waterfront, that watching how methodically I'd built the case against my own family had convinced her she wanted work that involved evidence and documentation, rather than centerpiece arrangements and vendor negotiations. A small, unexpected ripple of consequence I hadn't anticipated when I first called her, months earlier, asking careful, indirect questions about a bridal party group chat. Ruth and I talk most weeks now, a closeness that didn't exist before any of this happened, built initially out of shared strategic necessity and gradually, over the following 2 years, into something that has genuinely become the primary family relationship in my life, replacing, functionally, if not legally, the relationship I used to have with my mother. She retired fully from her forensic law practice about 18 months after my case concluded, handing most of her remaining clients to a younger partner, and told me over dinner one night, with the same flat directness she'd used the day she told me not to call my mother, that closing out my case had been, professionally, the most satisfying work of her entire career. Not because it was complicated, because honestly it wasn't. Your mother left a paper trail a first-year law student could follow, but because for once the person I was protecting actually deserved it, and I don't get to say that as often as you'd think in this line of work. I asked her once, months after everything had settled, whether she regretted letting her own decade-old dispute with my mother over their mother's estate go unresolved instead of pursuing it the way I'd pursued mine. She thought about it for a long moment and said, "No, that was property. This was you. I would have fought 100 times harder for you than I ever would have for a house I didn't even want. If there's a single lesson I've taken from all of this, and I've had 2 years now to sit with it, turn it over, examine it from every professional and personal angle available to me, it's this. The people who love you the least will often be the ones who assume you'll forgive them the fastest, because they've spent your entire relationship testing exactly how much they can take from you before you finally say no, and every time you don't say no, they file that away as proof the boundary doesn't actually exist. My mother spent 30 years assuming my achievements were background noise she didn't need to acknowledge, and somewhere in that assumption she developed the deeper, more dangerous belief that my resources, my house, my identity, my signature, were background noise too, available for the taking whenever her favorite child needed something and she didn't want to have an uncomfortable conversation about asking for it directly. I think about that constantly now. In every relationship I've rebuilt or chosen not to rebuild since the wedding, the difference between people who ask you for things and people who simply assume, based on years of your own silence, that they don't have to. I still have the magnolia tree, by the way. When I sold 214 Ashcroft Lane the second time, the legitimate time, through an actual lawyer's office with an actual notary who actually checked my actual driver's license, I paid a landscaping company $1,100 to dig it up, root ball and all, and replant it in the yard of the house on Sullivan's Island. And it's taken to the new soil better than I expected, put out a full flush of white blooms this past spring for the first time since the transplant. I think about what it means that the one thing I refused to leave behind, out of everything my family tried to take from me, was the thing I'd planted with my own hands the year I decided nobody would ever again have a say in what happened to something that belonged to me. So here's my question for you, watching this, and I mean it as something other than a rhetorical flourish. Is there a version of your own family's ledger you've been too afraid to actually add up, because you suspect, somewhere underneath the avoidance, that the numbers were never going to come out even in your favor? I haven't told you yet about the sentencing hearing itself, and I think it belongs here, in the fuller accounting, because it was the one moment in this entire ordeal where I was legally permitted to speak directly, in a courtroom, on the record, about exactly what had been taken from me, without a wedding toast's polite framing, or an intercom's clipped urgency shaping how much I could say. South Carolina law allows victims to deliver an impact statement before sentencing, and Priya Chandrasekaran, the assistant solicitor who'd carried the case from indictment through plea, told me 2 weeks beforehand that I could waive it if I wanted, that plenty of victims in family fraud cases chose not to speak because the emotional cost outweighed whatever closure the statement provided. I told her I wanted to speak. I had spent 9 weeks building a case with documents and dates and forensic handwriting comparisons, and I wanted once to build one with nothing but my own voice, in a room where my mother was legally required to sit still and listen without interrupting. The Charleston County Courthouse on Broad Street has a particular hush to it that I've since come to associate permanently with that single afternoon, high ceilings and dark wood paneling that swallow sound the way old buildings do, and I stood at a podium roughly 15 feet from the defense table where my mother sat in a gray cardigan that made her look older than her 59 years, next to Foster Halloway, who had, by that point, stopped offering much resistance beyond procedural formality. I told the judge, a measured, silver-haired woman named the Honorable Patricia Okonkwo Reyes, who had presided over enough family financial crimes to have developed a visible weariness with defendants who tried to minimize what they'd done, about the magnolia tree I'd planted the spring after my divorce. I told her about 11 years of 80-hour weeks building a career specifically so that no one, ever again, could tell me my resources belonged to someone else's decisions. I told her about a Thursday afternoon in Singapore and a wire alert for an escrow company I'd never heard of, and I watched, from the podium, my mother's shoulders curl slightly inward with each sentence. Not, I think, out of genuine remorse in that particular moment, but out of the specific discomfort of a woman who has spent her entire life controlling how she is perceived. Finally, completely, losing that control in a room full of strangers with the power to write her next 18 months. I told Judge Okonkwo-Reyes one more thing before I sat back down, something I hadn't planned to say and that surprised even me as it came out. That the hardest part of this entire experience hadn't been the forgery itself, hadn't been the $402,000, hadn't even been standing on a porch listening to my mother threaten to erase me from the family if I pursued justice. The hardest part had been sitting through that final Sunday dinner, eating pot roast at a table where 4 people I loved discussed the sale of my house as though it were a stroke of divine good fortune, and realizing that not one of them, not my mother, not my father, not my brother, not the woman about to become my sister-in-law, had thought to wonder, even once, out loud, at that table, whether I was okay. That the theft itself was almost secondary to the discovery that my absence from their moral accounting had apparently felt, to them, entirely unremarkable. Judge Okonkwo-Reyes, when she delivered sentencing 20 minutes later, referenced that specific portion of my statement directly, telling my mother from the bench that the court found the calculated, sustained nature of the deception, extending well beyond a single lapse in judgment, into a coordinated, multi-week fraud involving fabricated identification documents, to be an aggravating factor warranting the upper range of the recommended sentencing guidelines. Language that Ruth later told me almost certainly added 2 to 3 months to the sentence my mother ultimately served. Priya Nandi, the escrow officer who had processed the fraudulent sale, testified during the plea colloquy phase as a records custodian rather than a fully adversarial witness, and I spoke with her briefly in the courthouse hallway afterward, an encounter neither of us had planned but that ended up mattering to me more than I expected. She was younger than I'd imagined from the recorded intake call, maybe 26 or 27, and she told me, with visible distress that struck me as entirely genuine, that she had processed hundreds of closings over 4 years at Home Title and had never once had reason to doubt a family member's verbal confirmation of a signature. That the entire escrow system, she explained, relies on a baseline assumption of good faith between family members, that her training had never equipped her to interrogate. "I keep going back over the recording," she told me, her voice tight. "Your father sounded so calm, so normal. I've listened to it maybe 30 times since the detective first called me, trying to figure out what I should have heard that I didn't." I told her, honestly, that I didn't think there was anything she should have heard, that my father had spent 31 years in sales precisely because he was good at sounding calm and normal while saying things that weren't entirely true, and that the failure belonged to him, not to a 26-year-old escrow officer doing her job in good faith. She thanked me for saying that, and I don't know if it actually helped her the way I intended it to, but I meant it, and I think, in a story with as much bad faith running through it as this one, it mattered to name, clearly, at least one person whose only sin was trusting a system that assumed better of my parents than they deserved. I want to add one more layer to the financial accounting, because precision has been the discipline underlying everything I've told you, and precision demands I mention the numbers that never made it into any courtroom filing but that I tracked anyway, out of professional habit as much as anything else. The total cost of this ordeal to my family, calculated across restitution, legal fees, lost income from my father's job termination, the eventual forced sale of my parents' own house to cover the restitution shortfall once their savings and retirement accounts proved insufficient, and Carol Pruitt's lost notary income, came to just over $690,000 by the 2-year mark, nearly 75% more than the $402,000 they'd originally stolen. I've thought about that multiplier a great deal. The mathematical gap between what a fraud actually nets a perpetrator and what it eventually costs everyone connected to it once the consequences fully unfold. And I think it's the single clearest, most quantifiable proof of something I already believed from 11 years of forensic work, but had never before watched happen to people I personally loved. Fraud is never actually a shortcut. It's always, eventually, the most expensive path available, and the people who choose it are usually betting, consciously or not, that they'll be gone, dead, or forgiven before the bill ever fully arrives. My mother bet wrong. The bill arrived in 18 months, wearing a badge, at her son's wedding, delivered by the daughter she'd spent 30 years assuming would never add up the numbers. Before I close this out, I want to go back and fill in something I skipped over too quickly the first time, because it's the piece of this story that colleagues in my own field ask me about most often when they hear it, and it deserves the same careful accounting I've given everything else. How, exactly, does a forensic accountant confirm a forged signature well enough to hand a detective a case he later called one of the cleanest he'd ever received? It starts with something most people don't know exists: a discipline called forensic document examination, distinct from handwriting analysis in the pop culture sense, built around measurable, repeatable characteristics rather than gut instinct. Dr. Wen Huang, the examiner Ruth brought in, explained it to me over coffee one afternoon, in terms simple enough that I could follow it despite having no training in her specific field, though God knows I understood the underlying logic instantly, since fraud examination and document forensics share the same fundamental premise. Authentic behavior leaves a consistent, almost involuntary signature of its own, and fabricated behavior, no matter how carefully practiced, tends to betray itself in the seams. She walked me through the 7 samples she'd used: mortgage documents from 2021, a notarized power of attorney I'd signed years earlier when my grandmother was briefly hospitalized, 2 checks, a car title transfer, and a signed acknowledgement form from my own firm's employee handbook, spanning nearly a decade of my authentic signature, captured in different emotional and physical states: rushed, relaxed, at a hospital bedside, at a closing table. Across all 7, certain features remained remarkably stable regardless of context. The way my capital V began with a slight upward hook before descending, a habit I'd apparently developed in childhood and never consciously noticed, the consistent forward slant of roughly 12 degrees from vertical, the specific way my lowercase l's in Cole looped rather than stayed straight, a quirk left over from cursive lessons in a Savannah elementary school decades earlier. The forged signature on the deed replicated my name's general shape well enough to fool a notary who wasn't looking closely, but it missed nearly every one of those involuntary habits, because whoever forged it, almost certainly my mother herself, according to a supplementary analysis Dr. Huang later performed, comparing the forged signature against a sample of Linda Cole's own handwriting pulled from years of birthday cards I'd kept, had worked from a static image, a photograph of my signature copied and traced rather than internalized through years of unconscious repetition. And static images, Dr. Huang told me, can replicate shape but almost never replicate rhythm. The rhythm detail became, unexpectedly, one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case. More damaging in some ways than the print shop footage itself, because it established forgery through an independent, scientifically grounded methodology that didn't depend on any single witness's memory or cooperation. Dr. Huang's report included stroke pressure analysis derived from indentation patterns on the original paper document, which Home Title Escrow had, fortunately for the case, retained in its physical file rather than only digitally. And that analysis showed pen lift patterns inconsistent with a signature written in a single continuous motion. The telltale sign, she explained, of someone drawing a signature slowly, checking their work against a reference image, rather than signing their own name the way a person does thousands of times across a lifetime without ever consciously thinking about the individual letters. When Foster Holloway's team retained their own independent document examiner during pretrial discovery, hoping to challenge Dr. Huang's findings, that second examiner, a well-regarded practitioner from Atlanta named Carl Whitfield with no connection to either side, reviewed the same evidence and reached, according to the discovery exchange Ruth later shared with me, substantially the same conclusion. A development that Foster Holloway apparently cited as the specific turning point that pushed his client toward a plea rather than trial. I think about Walter Bishop's role in all of this often too, because his contribution rarely gets acknowledged properly in how people tell true crime stories. The quiet, methodical accumulation of small public records that individually prove nothing and collectively prove everything. He spent 4 full days just on the Notary Journal alone, cross-referencing every entry against public property records to establish that Carol Pruitt's documented practices elsewhere in that journal were in fact careful and by the book, checking 2 forms of identification where required, recording thumbprints for real estate transactions as South Carolina law demands, which made the single anomalous entry involving my forged ID stand out not as an example of general carelessness, but as a specific, isolated departure from an otherwise scrupulous professional pattern. Exactly the kind of anomaly that juries and judges find most persuasive, because it can't be explained away as habitual sloppiness. Walter told me once, over a working lunch during the investigation, that the cases that broke his heart most across 20 years in financial crimes weren't the elaborate ones, the ones with offshore accounts and shell companies, but the small, intimate ones like mine, where the fraud depended entirely on the perpetrator correctly calculating that the victim's love for them would slow down, if not prevent entirely, the moment of reckoning. Most people never even open the investigation, he said. They talk themselves out of it in the first week, because some part of them still hopes it was a misunderstanding. You never did that. Not once, not for a single day, and that's the only reason this case exists at all. I want to add something here about the version of myself that existed before any of this happened, because I think it's important for anyone watching this to understand that the woman who methodically built a felony case against her own mother wasn't a different person than the daughter who used to drive 40 minutes each way every Sunday for pot roast dinner, wasn't secretly harboring some deep, pre-existing resentment waiting for an excuse to detonate the family. I loved my mother. I want to say that plainly, without qualification, because the easy version of this story lets viewers imagine I'd been quietly building a case against her for years, watching for an opening, when the truth is almost the opposite. I spent 34 years extending her every possible benefit of the doubt, absorbing the small daily evidence of favoritism toward Derek, as ordinary parental imperfection rather than a pattern worth naming, telling myself that of course she loved me, she just expressed it differently than she expressed love for my brother, that my accomplishments mattered to her even if she rarely said so out loud. It took a forged signature and a fabricated driver's license to finally force me to look, with professional clarity, at 34 years of smaller evidence I'd spent my whole life explaining away. And I think that delay, that reluctance, is actually the most universal part of this story, more universal than the specific crime itself. Because I suspect most people watching this have some version of a ledger in their own family they've been avoiding adding up for exactly the same reason I avoided mine for 3.5 decades. The aftermath of the video going viral deserves its own accounting too, because it changed the shape of my life almost as dramatically as the fraud itself. Just in a direction nobody could have predicted sitting in Ruth's office that first jet-lagged afternoon. Within the first 72 hours of posting, the video had crossed 2 million views, and my phone, which I'd always treated as a fairly boring professional tool, transformed into something closer to a small, chaotic newsroom, message requests from producers at 3 different true crime podcasts, a cable news booker asking whether I'd consider a live interview segment, and an alarming number of strangers who'd apparently done their own amateur investigative work and tracked down Derek's new address, Brittany's professional Instagram, even, in one deeply unsettling instance, what someone claimed was my father's new part-time work schedule at the hardware store, all offered to me unsolicited as though I might want to use it for further public humiliation. I want to be clear that I didn't. I declined every single one of those messages, blocked the accounts that felt most invasive, and made a deliberate decision, with Ruth's strong encouragement, to let the legal system finish its work through the actual courts, rather than through an internet mob, however righteously that mob believed it was acting on my behalf. I did eventually agree to 2 interviews, both chosen carefully. The first was with a regional Charleston news outlet, a print reporter named Denise Okafor, who'd covered white-collar crime in the Low Country for over a decade, and approached the story with a level of procedural seriousness I recognized and respected, asking me detailed questions about restitution mechanics and notary regulation reform, rather than trying to extract a dramatic soundbite about family betrayal. Her piece, which ran roughly 6 weeks after the wedding once my mother's plea was finalized, became, unexpectedly, part of a broader statewide conversation about notary oversight, cited months later in testimony before a South Carolina legislative subcommittee reviewing whether the state's notary journal requirements needed strengthening, a genuinely strange and gratifying downstream consequence I never would have predicted when I was standing in a county clerk's office reading my own forged name off a printout. The second interview was with a financial crimes podcast hosted by 2 former FBI forensic accountants, an audience I actually cared about reaching, professionals in my own field who I hoped might learn something transferable from the specific methodology Ruth, Walter, and Dr. Huang had used to build the case. And that episode, which ran nearly 90 minutes and got into granular detail about stroke pressure analysis and notary journal cross-referencing, became, somewhat to my surprise, one of the most downloaded episodes in that podcast's history, generating a steady trickle of consulting inquiries from small business owners and estate attorneys that continued arriving for months afterward. I turned down every offer that felt like it wanted to turn my family's collapse into pure entertainment, a made-for-streaming dramatization, a tell-all ghost-written memoir with my name on the cover and somebody else's prose inside it, a request from a daytime talk show that wanted to fly my mother in via video call from a visitation room for what their booker described, with an enthusiasm I found genuinely nauseating as a real gut-punch reunion moment for the audience. I said no to all of it, not out of any particular moral superiority, but because I understood, the same way I understood everything else in this story through the lens of my own profession, that there's a difference between documenting a fraud accurately, which I believe this account has done from the very first sentence, and monetizing a family's pain for an audience's entertainment beyond what accuracy actually requires, and I've tried, across everything I've shared publicly since, to stay on the correct side of that line even when the financial incentive to cross it has occasionally been substantial. The consulting business that grew out of all this attention operates now out of a small office on Meeting Street, 4 employees, including myself, specializing almost entirely in the kind of case that started this whole story. Family trust and estate fraud, forged power of attorney documents, elder financial exploitation, the specific, intimate category of crime that happens not between strangers, but between people who share holidays and last names. A category that most large forensic accounting firms treat as low priority compared to corporate embezzlement cases with bigger price tags attached. And that I've built an entire practice around, precisely because I understand, in a way few of my competitors can claim to understand from lived experience, exactly how deeply that particular category of betrayal cuts, and exactly how methodical the response needs to be to actually hold up under legal scrutiny. My first major client after going independent was, in a detail I still find almost too neat to be believable even though it happened exactly this way, an elderly widow in Mount Pleasant whose adult son had been slowly draining her retirement accounts through a forged power of attorney, a case that took me 11 days to fully document, using nearly the identical methodology Walter Bishop had taught me by example 9 weeks earlier, and that ended 4 months later with her son pleading guilty to elder financial exploitation and the widow, whose name I won't share out of respect for her privacy, sending me a handwritten card that read simply, "Thank you for believing the numbers over the family story." I've thought a great deal over the 2 years since all of this happened about the particular emotional discipline required to do what I did. Because I know, from the comments under that video and from private messages people have sent me since, that plenty of viewers assumed some version of coldness or calculation must have been present in me long before my mother forged that signature, a kind of pre-existing ruthlessness that simply found its opportunity. I don't think that's accurate, and I want to push back on it directly, because I think it lets people off the hook too easily. Lets them imagine that a normal, loving daughter would never have been capable of what I did, when the truth I've come to understand is nearly the opposite. Any daughter with access to the right documentation, the right legal counsel, and the willingness to prioritize truth over comfort for 11 consecutive weeks could have done exactly what I did. The rarity isn't in the capacity. The rarity is in the willingness, because almost everyone, when faced with proof their own family betrayed them, reaches immediately for a story that makes the betrayal smaller, more forgivable, more survivable without confrontation. And I understand that impulse intimately because I felt it too. Every single day those 11 weeks, the quiet, exhausting pull toward just letting it go, toward telling myself the wedding mattered more than the principle, toward believing my mother's insistence that pursuing this would destroy the family rather than simply revealing what the family had already, secretly, become. There's a detail from the wedding day I haven't shared yet that I think belongs here, because it's the moment that made me understand, watching it unfold in real time, exactly how thoroughly my family had convinced itself that appearances could substitute for accountability. About 40 minutes before the toasts began, while I stood near the bar nursing a club soda because I needed my head completely clear for what was coming, I overheard my mother talking to her book club friend Deborah Ashwood, a woman who'd known our family for close to 20 years, gesturing toward the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows and saying, in the same bright hostess voice she'd used my entire childhood, "Doesn't it just feel like everything came together exactly the way it was supposed to?" I keep telling Gary, sometimes the universe just provides. Deborah, who had no idea what those words actually meant, who genuinely believed she was hearing a mother's proud reflection on a beautifully executed wedding rather than a coded reference to a felony, nodded warmly, and said something about how blessed the family clearly was. And I stood 8 feet away holding a glass of club soda, listening to my mother describe identity theft as divine provision to a woman who trusted her completely, and I felt, in that specific moment, less anger than a kind of vertiginous disbelief at how completely a person could restructure reality around their own convenience. I want to walk through the guest list reactions a bit more fully too, because the video that eventually circulated only captured the roughly 90 seconds surrounding the arrest itself. And there was a longer, stranger aftermath in that ballroom that never made it into any clip. The 20 or so minutes immediately following the officer's departure with my parents, when 200 wedding guests, dressed in cocktail attire, holding half-finished drinks, had to somehow collectively decide what to do with themselves. Some left immediately, a small exodus of aunts and family friends who clearly felt they'd witnessed something too raw and too private to remain present for, murmuring apologies to Derek and Brittany on their way out that sounded more like fleeing than genuine condolence. A surprising number stayed, though, clustered in small, hushed groups near the bar and along the glass windows overlooking the marsh, and I moved through several of those clusters over the following hour, not to gloat, though I understand why some viewers of the video assumed that was my intention, but because Detective Odom had asked me to remain available in case any guest had relevant information, and because, frankly, I didn't yet know where else to go once the moment I'd spent 9 weeks building toward had actually happened. Felicia, the wedding coordinator, to her considerable professional credit, managed the practical chaos of the remaining event with a composure I found genuinely admirable under the circumstances, quietly instructing the catering staff to hold the cake cutting indefinitely, redirecting the jazz trio towards softer, more ambient material, and at one point pulling me aside to ask, with a directness I appreciated, whether I needed anything: water, a quiet room to sit in, a ride home, treating me, correctly, as someone who had just lived through something enormous, rather than as the villain of the evening. Some of the more shell-shocked guests seemed to be quietly deciding I must be. I told her I was fine, though I wasn't, not really, and she nodded and said, "For what it's worth, I've coordinated over 200 weddings and I've never seen anything like tonight. But for whatever my opinion is worth, you didn't do anything wrong up there. You just told the truth at the worst possible moment for everyone except you." I've held on to that sentence longer than almost anything else anyone said to me that night, because it named, more precisely than I'd managed to name it myself, the exact shape of what I'd done. Not an act of cruelty, but an act of truth-telling whose timing happened to be devastating for everyone who'd spent 9 days hoping the truth could be postponed indefinitely. Detective Odom, before he left the ballroom that night with my parents in custody, took a moment to speak with me privately near the coat check, out of earshot of the remaining guests, and told me something that I think closes out the criminal justice portion of this story more honestly than any statistic about restitution amounts could. "I've been doing this 22 years, he said. "Most family fraud cases, by the time they reach my desk, the evidence has gone stale. Witnesses have talked themselves out of cooperating, or the victims decided it's easier to just eat the loss than put their own mother through a criminal trial. You didn't let any of that happen. You moved fast, you kept your mouth shut until the case was airtight, and you let the evidence do the talking instead of your emotions. I tell young detectives all the time that the best witnesses are the ones who think like investigators instead of victims." Tonight I got to watch one do it in real time, on her brother's wedding day, in front of 200 people, and still keep her composure enough to hand me a clean arrest. That's not nothing. I hope you know that's not nothing. I want to be honest about the parts of that night that weren't clean or composed, though, because I think a story that only shows the controlled, procedural version of what happened does a disservice to how genuinely difficult it was to live through, video footage or no video footage. After Detective Odom left, after the last stragglers finally departed and Felicia's staff began quietly breaking down the centerpieces nobody would ever pay the remaining balance on, I sat alone at a small table near the emergency exit for almost 40 minutes, still in my navy dress with the recording device still clipped inside it, and I cried, not the composed, camera-ready tears of a redemption narrative, but the messy, hiccuping, entirely private tears of a 34-year-old woman who had just watched both of her parents led out of a building in handcuffs and understood, with total clarity, that whatever version of her family had existed before that Thursday afternoon wire alert in Singapore was never coming back, regardless of parole dates or restitution schedules or eventual, complicated attempts at repair. Nobody filmed that part. I wouldn't have wanted them to, but it happened. And I think it matters that people watching this understand that justice and grief aren't opposites, that you can build the most airtight fraud case of your professional career and still sit alone in an empty ballroom afterward and cry for the family you didn't have, rather than the one you just finished exposing. People ask me often, now, whether I've dated anyone since the divorce and everything that followed, and I include the answer here not because it's central to the fraud narrative, but because it's become, unexpectedly, one of the most direct through lines connecting who I was before this happened to who I've become since. I have, cautiously, over the past year, and I've noticed something about myself in the process that I don't think I would have recognized without everything that happened with my family. I now watch, with the same forensic attentiveness I once reserved exclusively for financial documents, how a person treats small requests for access, whether they ask before assuming, whether they respect a stated boundary the first time it's stated or treat it as an opening bid to be negotiated down through persistence. It's made me a more careful partner, and, I'll admit, a more exhausting one in the early stages of getting to know someone, because I no longer extend the reflexive, unexamined trust I extended my own mother for 34 years. And I've had to learn, slowly, that requiring people to earn that trust through demonstrated respect for boundaries isn't the same thing as being incapable of trust altogether, even though it took me the better part of a year to fully believe that distinction myself. I think often, too, about the version of this story where I never got that wire alert, where the escrow transaction somehow slipped past my bank's $5,000 notification threshold, where I came home from Singapore 3 months later than I actually did, after the wedding had already happened, after the money had already been spent, after Carol Pruitt's notary journal entry had aged into the kind of paperwork nobody thinks to double-check anymore. I think about that version because I suspect it's closer to what my mother actually believed would happen, closer to the story she'd constructed in her own head about how this would unfold. A daughter who traveled constantly for work, distracted, generous, conflict-averse, who might notice eventually that something was off with the house, but who would, by the time she noticed, be facing a wedding, already happened. A brother already married, a family narrative already calcified around everything worked out, and who would, faced with the enormous social cost of unraveling all of that after the fact, likely decide the path of least resistance was simply to let it go, to accept a vague, hand-waved explanation about family helping family, and move forward with the relationship intact rather than shattered. I think my mother's entire plan depended on a fundamental miscalculation about who I actually was, a miscalculation built from 34 years of watching me absorb small slights without visible retaliation, and mistaking that absorption for permanent passivity rather than what it actually was, which was patience that had never yet been tested against something this severe. I want to close this account with something that happened almost exactly 1 year after the wedding, on the anniversary of that Thursday afternoon wire alert, rather than the wedding date itself. Because I've come to think of that Thursday, not the porch confrontation and not the arrest, as the actual turning point of my entire adult life. I was at my new house on Sullivan's Island, sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the magnolia tree that had survived its transplant put out its second full season of blooms in its new soil, when my phone buzzed with an email notification from the South Carolina Secretary of State's office. A routine update I'd requested months earlier tracking the legislative subcommittee hearing on notary reform that had cited Denise Okafor's reporting on my case. The subcommittee had voted, that morning, to recommend stricter identification verification requirements for real estate notarizations statewide, including mandatory photo comparison against a secondary government database rather than relying solely on physical ID inspection, a reform that would, if enacted, make the specific fraud committed against me significantly harder to replicate against anyone else in the state going forward. I sat on that porch for a long time after reading the notification, coffee going cold in my hands, thinking about how strange it was that the worst thing my family had ever done to me had produced, as one of its final downstream consequences, a small, genuine improvement to how thoroughly the state protects every future daughter whose mother might someday stand in a print shop with a stolen photograph, deciding her child's identity was hers to spend. I don't know exactly what happens next in this family, and I've stopped pretending, even to myself, that I can predict it with any confidence. My mother will be released on parole within the next several months, and I don't know whether I'll see her when that happens, whether some cautious, heavily boundaried version of a relationship is possible between us, or whether the 4 words I said through that intercom turned out to be not just an accusation, but an actual, permanent ending. My father calls occasionally, always careful, always brief, and I've started, tentatively, taking those calls, not because I've fully forgiven him, but because his admission on that recorded line the morning of the wedding, his willingness to say yes when I asked him directly whether he'd known, feels like it opened a door that my mother's initial threats on the porch closed, and I'm still deciding whether I want to walk through it. Derek and I remain in the strange, unresolved middle territory 2 people occupy when they share a childhood and very little else anymore. I don't know if any of these relationships heal fully, or whether some of them are simply over in every way that matters, dressed up in the polite fiction of remaining technically, legally, biologically family. I mentioned earlier that this pattern of favoritism stretched back through my entire childhood, and I think it's worth grounding that claim in specific memories, rather than leaving it as a vague, unfalsifiable impression. Because precision is the discipline I've tried to hold myself to throughout this entire account, and I don't want the earliest chapter of this story to be the one place I let myself off that hook. When I was 11 and Derek was 6, I won the statewide Future Problem Solvers competition for our age division. A genuine achievement I'd worked toward for months, building a full policy proposal about coastal erosion mitigation that our regional coordinator told my parents, at the award ceremony, was the strongest entry she'd seen from an elementary schooler in 8 years of judging. My mother's photo album from that year, which I still have, contains exactly one picture from that ceremony, blurry, taken from the back of the auditorium, and 14 pictures from a t-ball game Derek played in the same spring, in which, according to the box score printed in the local paper my mother had clipped and preserved in the same album, he struck out 4 times and dropped a routine fly ball in right field. When I was 16, I got my driver's license and asked my parents whether I could use the family's older sedan to drive myself to my after-school job at a bookstore. A job I'd taken specifically to start saving for college since my parents had made clear, without ever saying so explicitly, that Derek's future private tutoring and travel baseball league fees were a higher household budget priority than any contribution toward my eventual tuition. My mother told me the sedan needed to stay available in case Derek, then 11, needed a ride to baseball practice on short notice, an explanation that made a certain narrow logistical sense in isolation, but that, layered onto years of similar small deprioritizations, taught me early and thoroughly that my needs occupied a permanently lower tier in my family's resource allocation than my brother's wants. I ended up walking the 1.5 miles to the bookstore for the better part of a year, in Charleston humidity that left me changing shirts in the store's back room before every shift, while my mother drove Derek to practices he frequently skipped anyway, a detail I only learned years later from his own high school teammates at a reunion event, who told me, with the casual cruelty of people who don't realize they're revealing something painful, that Derek had been notorious for no-showing practice and getting benched, and that our mother had covered for him with the coach every single time, calling in fabricated excuses about family obligations, rather than let him face the natural consequence of his own unreliability. I want to be fair here because fairness has mattered to me throughout this entire account, even when it would have been easier, dramatically, to render every family member as uniformly, cartoonishly villainous. My mother was not, across my childhood, cruel to me in any way that would have registered clearly to an outside observer, or even, most of the time, to me. She came to my graduations. She kept that blurry photo from the Future Problem Solvers ceremony, evidence that some part of her did register the achievement as worth documenting, however minimally. She told her book club, accurately, that her daughter was doing so well, even if the phrase always felt to me like praise delivered at a professional distance rather than the warm, specific pride she showered on Derek for accomplishments that, objectively, measured against mine, were considerably smaller. The favoritism operated almost entirely through omission and default rather than active cruelty, through whose needs got assumed as automatic priorities and whose needs got treated as reasonable to defer. And I think that specific mechanism, the quiet arithmetic of whose comfort gets protected by default, is exactly what allowed it to continue for over 3 decades without ever producing a single dramatic confrontation clear enough for anyone, including me, to definitively name it as favoritism, until a forged signature finally forced the entire pattern into unavoidable, quantifiable focus. There's one more memory I want to include, because I think it's the one that, in retrospect, most directly foreshadowed everything that eventually happened with the house. When I was 22, newly graduated from the College of Charleston and about to leave for my master's program at Georgetown, my mother asked me, over dinner, whether I'd be willing to co-sign a small loan for Derek, then 17, to buy a used car, since his own part-time job income wasn't sufficient to qualify on his own, and my father's credit was, at that point, already fairly leveraged from 2 other family financial commitments I only learned the details of much later. I said no, gently but clearly, explaining that I was about to take on significant student loan debt of my own and couldn't responsibly add contingent liability for a car loan on top of it, and I remember my mother's face in that moment, with total clarity, the same small tightening around the eyes I would later see on the porch, and again at the wedding, the specific expression of a woman recalculating her strategy after an initial approach failed to produce the expected compliance. She didn't push further that night. She simply, I now understand with the benefit of everything that followed, filed the refusal away and waited 12 years for an opportunity where my consent wouldn't be required at all, where a forged signature and a fabricated ID could simply route around the boundary I'd first drawn, politely but firmly, at a dinner table when I was 22 years old and had no idea I was establishing a precedent my mother would eventually decide to circumvent entirely, rather than ever respect. Looking back across all of it now, the T-ball photos, the mile-and-a-half walks to the bookstore, the car loan refusal that apparently registered to my mother not as a legitimate boundary but as an obstacle to root around, I think the forged deed wasn't actually an aberration in my family's pattern at all. It was simply the pattern's final, most extreme expression, the moment 34 years of small, cumulative decisions about whose needs mattered more, finally metastasized into something a court of law could recognize as a felony, because by that point the underlying belief that my resources existed to be redirected toward Derek's comfort whenever the family calculus demanded it, had been reinforced so many times in so many smaller ways, across so many uncontested years, that my mother genuinely seems to have believed, walking into that print shop with my photograph in her hand, that she was simply doing what the family had always done, just with slightly higher stakes and a slightly more elaborate mechanism than covering for a missed baseball practice. I want to spend a little more time on Ruth, because I don't think I've fully conveyed how strange and specific it felt to rebuild, in the span of 11 weeks, an entirely new primary family relationship with a woman I'd barely spoken to in 4 years. A relationship that had to carry, almost overnight, the emotional weight that 34 years with my mother had just catastrophically failed to sustain. Ruth is 66, silver-haired, sharp in a way that never softens for social comfort, and she told me once, over the dinner where she mentioned closing my case had been the most satisfying work of her career, something about her own estrangement from my mother that reframed the entire family dynamic for me, in a way I hadn't previously understood. The property dispute that had separated them for nearly a decade, the one over their own mother's estate, had involved my mother attempting to claim a larger share of the estate than the will actually specified, using a photocopied, unsigned document she claimed represented my grandmother's true final wishes. A document Ruth, even then working as a federal prosecutor, had immediately recognized as almost certainly fabricated. I let it go because it was $11,000 and I didn't want a decade of ugliness with my own sister over $11,000, Ruth told me. I've spent the years since wondering whether letting it go taught her the wrong lesson. Whether if I'd pushed back hard enough then, really made her face what she'd done, she never would have gotten comfortable enough to try something $400,000 bigger against her own daughter 12 years later. I don't know if that's fair to myself, but I think about it. That conversation changed something in how I understood the entire arc of what happened to me, because it meant my mother's willingness to forge documents against family members wasn't a single, isolated moral collapse triggered uniquely by Derek's wedding. It was a demonstrated pattern with at least one documented prior instance, one that had gone unpunished, unconfronted, absorbed quietly by a sister who chose family peace over accountability, and lived, according to her own account, with a low, persistent uncertainty about whether that choice had inadvertently emboldened the exact behavior that eventually destroyed her relationship with her sister completely, and nearly destroyed mine with my mother as well. I've thought about that lesson constantly since, in every context far beyond my own family, in how I now approach my forensic consulting work, in how I think about small boundary violations in any relationship, professional or personal. The uncontested first instance of dishonesty rarely stays contained to its original scale. It tends, instead, to become a tested hypothesis about what a person can get away with, refined and scaled up the next time an opportunity presents itself, unless someone, at some point, draws a hard enough line to disprove the hypothesis definitively. Walter Bishop retired from investigative work about 8 months after my case concluded, not because of anything related to what happened with my family specifically, but because 20 years of financial crimes work had reached its natural endpoint for him, and he took a part-time position teaching a forensic investigation course at a community college, using, he told me with evident pride when he called to share the news, an anonymized version of my case as one of his primary teaching examples, walking students through exactly the sequence of public records requests, notary journal analysis, and paper trail reconstruction that had built the foundation Detective Odom eventually used to secure the arrest warrant. He asked my permission before using the case in his coursework, which I appreciated, and I told him yes, on the condition that he emphasize, to every cohort of students who ever studied it, the specific detail I consider most important for anyone entering that field. That the case broke not because of any single brilliant investigative insight, but because ordinary, patient, methodical documentation, done consistently and without shortcuts, over 11 straight weeks, eventually produces evidence too solid for any defense attorney to meaningfully dispute. I think that lesson matters beyond forensic accounting, too. Most vindication, in my experience, doesn't arrive through dramatic revelation. It arrives through unglamorous persistence that most people give up on somewhere around week 3, once the initial adrenaline of discovery fades and the tedious, unglamorous work of actually building a case begins. I've also thought a great deal about Brittany's role in all of this, more than I initially expected to, because I think she represents a category of complicity that our culture generally lets off far too easily. The person who benefits enormously from someone else's crime while maintaining careful, deliberate ignorance of its specifics, a strategy that provides plausible deniability without ever requiring the actual moral discomfort of confronting what she almost certainly suspected. I don't think Brittany knew, with documentary certainty, that my signature had been forged and a fake ID manufactured at a print shop off Highway 17. But her own written message to Ashley Kirkendall, the one where she explicitly said she'd stopped asking questions because she didn't want the money's origin to become her problem, proves she understood enough to recognize that curiosity carried risk and chose comfort over integrity at exactly the juncture where a genuinely careful person would have insisted on knowing more before accepting the benefit. I've come to believe that specific choice, willful, documented, strategic ignorance in service of personal gain deserves nearly as much scrutiny as active participation, even though our legal system, correctly in the narrow technical sense, only had grounds to prosecute the people who actively committed the forgery and fraud, rather than the people who simply chose not to ask inconvenient questions about where $280,000 had suddenly come from. I want to describe in more sensory detail than I have so far what those 11 weeks actually felt like day to day, because I think the clean, procedural way I've narrated the investigation risks making it sound easier and more emotionally contained than it actually was to live through. I lost 9 pounds during that stretch, not intentionally, simply because my appetite disappeared somewhere around week 3 and never fully returned until well after the wedding. I developed a habit, which persisted for months afterward, of waking at 3 or 4 a.m. and lying in the dark of whatever hotel room I was staying in, running through the case file in my head, checking and rechecking the logical sequence for any gap a defense attorney might eventually exploit. A nightly ritual that Ruth eventually recognized as a symptom of something closer to trauma response than professional diligence, and gently suggested I bring up with a therapist. Advice I initially resisted out of the same stubborn self-reliance that had gotten me through the entire investigation and eventually accepted. About 4 months after the wedding, once the adrenaline of the active case had fully drained away and left something heavier and harder to name sitting underneath it. The therapist I eventually started seeing, a woman named Dr. Adaize Nwosu, who specializes in family estrangement and complex trauma, told me something in our 3rd or 4th session that reframed the entire experience for me in a way I've carried since. She said that people who grow up as the reliable, competent child in a family with a favored sibling often develop what she called a documentation reflex, an unconscious habit of gathering proof and building airtight cases in every domain of life. Not because they're naturally suspicious people, but because they learned early, through repeated experience, that their version of events would be doubted or dismissed unless supported by overwhelming, undeniable evidence, while the favored sibling's version of events was simply accepted on faith. She suggested that my entire career choice, forensic fraud examination, a profession built entirely around not accepting a story at face value until the paper trail confirms it, might not be coincidental to my childhood at all, might in fact be a direct, adaptive response to 34 years of learning that my own account of reality needed independent corroboration to be believed by the people who were supposed to believe me automatically. I sat with that idea for a long time after that session, turning it over the way I turn over evidence in a case file, and I think she's right, and I think it's one of the more uncomfortable truths this entire experience forced me to confront, that my greatest professional strength and my deepest childhood wound might be, in some fundamental sense, the exact same thing. I've also had to sit with a harder question, one I don't think I've fully resolved even now, 2 years out, whether I would make the same choices again, knowing everything I know now about the actual human cost, my father's job, Carol Pruitt's career, the $690,000 total price tag, the year of 3 a.m. wake-ups, the family I no longer fully have. I want to answer that question honestly rather than with the tidy, unambiguous confidence a redemption narrative would prefer. Most days, yes, I would do exactly the same thing, because the alternative, letting a forged signature and a fabricated government ID pass without consequence, would have taught my mother, definitively, that my consent and my identity were negotiable resources available whenever family convenience demanded it. A lesson I refused to let stand uncorrected, regardless of what it cost the people who taught it to her in the first place, who taught it to me, more precisely, by deciding 34 years of my competence and reliability meant my boundaries could be treated as suggestions rather than the actual, legally enforceable limits they always were. But some days, particularly around the holidays, particularly when I see families in restaurants clearly enjoying an uncomplicated, unlitigated closeness I no longer have access to, I feel the full weight of what pursuing accountability actually cost me, and I don't think those two feelings, conviction and grief, ever fully resolve into a single clean verdict. I think they coexist, permanently, the way most consequential decisions in a real life do, regardless of how clean the narrative arc looks from the outside once a case file closes and a video goes viral, and strangers online declare, with the easy certainty of people who weren't the ones standing on that porch, that justice was obviously, unambiguously served. What I know for certain, sitting here 2 years later with a magnolia tree that survived its transplant, and a career built partly on the ashes of my own family, and a relationship with an aunt that's become more genuinely maternal than my actual mother's ever managed to be, is this. The version of me who drove to the county register of deeds office instead of straight to her parents' house, who called her estranged aunt before she called her own mother, who wore a recording device to her brother's wedding, not out of malice, but out of 11 years of professional habit demanding documentation before confrontation. That version of me made the only choice consistent with everything I actually believe about truth, evidence, and consequence. I don't know what the next chapter of this family looks like. I don't know if my mother's release next year opens any door I'm willing to walk through, or whether the 4 words I said through that intercom really were the permanent ending they felt like in the moment. What I know is that I will never again mistake silence for peace, or absorption for love, or the absence of confrontation for the presence of safety, in this family or in any relationship I build going forward. And if this story taught you anything about your own family's ledger, I hope it's that particular lesson above every other one. I mentioned Dr. Adeze Nwosu's observation about the documentation reflex, and I want to extend that thought a little further, because it connects to something Ruth said to me much later, almost a year after the case had fully concluded, that I think closes the loop on why this entire ordeal unfolded the way it did, rather than collapsing, as so many family fraud situations do, into a quiet, unresolved simmer that never reaches any court docket at all. Ruth told me that in her 19 years as a federal prosecutor, the single biggest predictor of whether a family fraud case ever actually reached indictment wasn't the size of the theft or even the strength of the evidence. It was whether the victim had, somewhere earlier in their life, developed the specific psychological permission to treat a family member's wrongdoing as equivalent, in seriousness, to a stranger's wrongdoing. Most people, she said, carry an unconscious hierarchy where the exact same act, forging a signature, lying to an escrow officer, fabricating a government ID, registers as unforgivable when a stranger does it, and merely disappointing, painful but ultimately survivable without formal consequence, when a parent does it. Breaking that hierarchy, she said, treating my mother's forgery with the same evidentiary rigor and moral seriousness I would have applied to any other forensic fraud case that crossed my desk, was the actual rare, decisive act in this entire story, rarer even than the crime itself, because most people, faced with proof of a parent's betrayal, spend their remaining energy managing their own emotional dissonance rather than building an actual case. I think about the Charleston I grew up in constantly now too, a city I still love despite everything, its marshlight and its live oaks and its particular humid slowness in August, and I think about how much of what happened to me depended on very specific, very local infrastructure. A county register of deeds office with searchable public records, a notary journal law that required Carol Pruitt to document her transactions in enough detail to eventually convict her, a sheriff's office financial crimes unit staffed by a detective who happened to have his own personal history with family financial exploitation and treated my case with a seriousness. Some departments, I've since learned from other forensic accountants I've talked to across the country, simply don't extend to cases that fall on the more intimate side of the fraud spectrum. I've become something of an advocate, in the 2 years since, for exactly the kind of legislative reform the Notary Subcommittee eventually recommended, testifying myself, eventually, before a follow-up hearing roughly 14 months after the wedding, not as a victim seeking further vengeance, but as a forensic professional arguing that the specific vulnerabilities that allowed my mother's fraud to succeed as long as it did, The assumption of good faith in family transactions. The relatively minimal ID verification standards for notarized real estate documents exist as exploitable gaps in nearly every state system, and that closing them protects people who will never have my professional training, my aunt's legal background, or the 11 years of forensic habit that let me build a case fast enough to catch the fraud before the statute of limitations or simple evidence decay made it unprovable. There's a particular kind of quiet that's settled over my life in the 2 years since all of this happened, one I've come to value more than I expected to when I was first adjusting to it. My house on Sullivan's Island doesn't have the constant, orbiting gravity of family obligation my old life in Charleston proper always carried. The Sunday dinners, the venue walkthroughs, the group chats demanding immediate emotional labor, and in its place I've built something smaller and, I think, considerably more honest. A handful of close friendships, my rebuilt relationship with Ruth, occasional careful calls with my father, a professional community of forensic accountants and estate attorneys who understand exactly what my work involves without requiring me to translate or minimize it, and a version of solitude that no longer feels like the isolation I feared it might become, the night I sat alone in that ballroom crying after the officers left. I planted a second tree last spring, a live oak this time, small enough now that it looks almost comically undersized against the eventual 50-foot canopy it will someday produce. And I think about that tree the way I think about the magnolia I saved from the old house, as evidence, physical and undeniable, that I intend to still be standing on this particular piece of ground decades from now, long after restitution payments finish clearing and parole hearings conclude and the video that made this story public eventually stops circulating and fades into whatever internet archive holds 11 million view videos that people stop actively sharing. I want to end with the actual numbers, because numbers are where this story started. A $5,000 wire alert threshold, a $415,000 house purchased in cash, a $402,000 fraudulent sale, and I think it's fitting to close with them too. As of this recording, restitution payments toward the original $402,000 stand at just under $290,000 collected, with the remainder scheduled across the next 3 years of payments from my father's reduced income and whatever portion of my mother's eventual post-release earnings the court order continues to garnish. My consulting practice, in its second full year of independent operation, generated just over $1.1 million in revenue, roughly 4 times what I earned in my final year as a senior associate at my old firm. The magnolia tree, transplanted at a cost of $1,100, produced 41 distinct blooms this past spring, a number I know precisely because I counted them one morning with my coffee, standing in a yard that belongs entirely and unambiguously to me, purchased through a transaction where every signature, every single one, on every page of every document, was genuinely, verifiably, unmistakably mine, checked twice by a notary who actually looked at my driver's license, held it up to the light, compared the photo to my face twice, and asked me a careful follow-up question about the property before stamping anything at all, the way a careful, honest notary is actually supposed to. There's one final thread I want to pull on before I close this out, because I think it answers the question I imagine some of you are still turning over. Whether any part of me regrets choosing my brother's wedding day specifically as the moment for all of this to surface, rather than some quieter, less publicly devastating occasion. I've asked myself that question more times than I can count, and the honest answer is that I didn't choose the wedding day out of any desire for maximum spectacle or humiliation, even though I understand why, from the outside, it looks exactly like that. I chose it because Detective Odom and Ruth both independently identified it as the point of maximum evidentiary clarity, the single day on the calendar when every dollar of the stolen $402,000 would be conclusively, undeniably spent and traceable, when flight risk was lowest because my parents' entire social and financial life was anchored to a single visible event, and when the largest possible number of people who mattered to my mother's carefully constructed reputation would be gathered in one room, removing any possibility that she could later claim, to her book club, to her sorority sisters, to the extended family who hadn't been in that ballroom, that this had all been some private, exaggerated misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a bitter daughter. I needed witnesses precisely because I understood, from 34 years of watching my mother operate, that without them, she would spend the rest of her life rewriting this story into something smaller and more sympathetic to herself. The way she'd apparently already rewritten, in her own memory, an $11,000 fraud against her own sister into a forgotten footnote rather than the pattern-establishing crime it actually was. I think about Derek's face in the moment, right after I said what I said, before Detective Odom walked through those doors, the split second where he was still processing the words rather than the consequences, and I've gone back and forth for 2 years about whether I owe him a more private, less devastating version of that revelation that I never got the chance to offer because the wedding day timeline had already been set in motion by evidentiary necessity rather than any desire on my part to specifically ambush him at his own reception. I've concluded, after a great deal of thought, that I don't owe him that, not because I don't care about the collateral damage to a marriage that, by every indication in the case file, was already built on a foundation Brittany herself had chosen to leave uninspected, but because the alternative, a quiet conversation with Derek beforehand, would have required trusting him with information he had already demonstrated. Through that voicemail about flight logistics, he was prepared to prioritize below his own convenience the moment he learned it. I couldn't risk that. Ruth couldn't risk it either, professionally, because any advance warning to any family member created a real, documentable risk of evidence destruction or flight that could have collapsed the entire case before Detective Odom ever got the chance to execute a warrant that had taken 11 weeks of patient, methodical work to build. I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who recognizes even a fragment of their own family in what I've described. The quiet arithmetic of favoritism, the parent who treats your resources as communal property whenever a sibling's needs demand it, the family member who's learned, across years of unchallenged small transgressions, that your boundaries function more as suggestions than actual limits. I'm not telling you that every family conflict deserves a forensic case file and a felony prosecution. Most don't and most shouldn't, because most family disputes genuinely are misunderstandings rather than premeditated fraud, and the specific severity of what happened to me, a forged deed, a fabricated government ID, $402,000 in stolen equity, sits at an extreme end of a spectrum most families never approach. What I am telling you is that the instinct to minimize, to explain away, to protect a comfortable family narrative at the direct cost of your own documented reality is worth examining honestly, at whatever scale it shows up in your own life. Because that instinct is exactly what my mother spent 34 years counting on, and it very nearly worked. And it only stopped working the specific moment I decided my own evidence deserved the same weight I would have given a stranger's. In a case file, on a desk, at a job I'd spent 11 years building specifically so that no one, family included, could ever again tell me my version of events didn't matter enough to investigate. The last thing I want to tell you is about a phone call I got 2 weeks ago, entirely unrelated to any of this, from a woman named Christine who found my consulting practice through a referral and told me, in a voice I recognized instantly because it was the same voice I'd used with Ruth in that first conversation from a county clerk's office, that she'd just discovered her sister had been forging her signature on shared inheritance documents for the better part of a year, moving money out of an account meant to be split evenly between them. She asked me, at the end of that first call, whether I thought she was overreacting, whether pursuing this formally, with documentation and possibly law enforcement, was going to destroy her family the way she suspected her sister would tell everyone it had. I told her what Ruth told me 2 years earlier in an office overlooking the Charleston waterfront, that the family had already been destroyed the moment her sister decided forgery was an acceptable tool for getting what she wanted, and that the only remaining question was whether Christine was going to let that destruction stay invisible and unaccounted for, or whether she was going to do the patient, unglamorous work of making it visible, documented, and impossible to minimize. She hired my firm that afternoon. We start pulling bank records next week. I keep a copy of that original deed printout, the one Purnell, the county clerk, slid across the counter to me that first morning back in Charleston, in a drawer in my home office on Sullivan's Island, not out of any morbid attachment to the worst moment of my adult life, but because I look at it sometimes when a new client sits across from me describing their own family's version of the same fundamental crime. My father's sale to Brittany's cousin, my sister's power of attorney, my son's forged endorsement on a settlement check, and it reminds me exactly what that first document felt like in my hands before I understood what it meant, before I knew the word home title escrow or the name Carol Pruitt, back when it was still just an unfamiliar printout with my own name misused at the bottom of it. Every client who walks into my office is standing exactly where I stood that morning, holding proof they don't yet fully understand, and I've built my entire professional identity around the specific competence of helping people move from that disoriented, disbelieving first read to the kind of documented, evidentiary clarity that eventually let a judge, a jury, or a plea negotiation recognize what they already privately knew to be true. Dr. Wen Huang and I still work together occasionally, now as professional colleagues rather than expert witness and grieving client, and she told me once, over a case consultation unrelated to my own family, that my case remains, professionally, one of the cleanest examples of static image forgery she's examined in over 15 years of practice. Precisely because my mother, working from a photograph rather than any genuine familiarity with the physical act of writing my name, produced a signature that was visually convincing enough to fool a distracted notary, but structurally incapable of surviving actual forensic scrutiny. I think there's something almost instructive in that fact beyond the specific mechanics of handwriting analysis. My mother spent 34 years watching me from a kind of emotional distance, present at the events, keeping the photographs, saying the right words at the right moments, without ever developing the deep, unconscious familiarity that real closeness produces. And when she finally needed to reproduce something essential about me, my actual signature, the literal mark that represents my identity under the law, all she had to work from was a static image, a surface impression rather than genuine knowledge, and it showed, immediately and permanently, to anyone who knew how to actually look. I don't know how to end a story that, in the most literal sense, hasn't actually ended, since my mother is still serving her sentence, since restitution payments are still arriving in installments, since Derek and I are still somewhere in the unresolved middle of whatever our relationship becomes next, since the legislative reform I testified in support of is still moving, slowly, through a subcommittee process that may or may not produce lasting change before some future legislative session lets it quietly die. What I can tell you, with the same evidentiary confidence I bring to every case file that crosses my desk, is that the version of my life on the other side of all this, the consulting practice, the house on Sullivan's Island, the transplanted magnolia tree with its 41 blooms, the rebuilt relationship with an aunt who fights harder for me than my own mother ever did, is genuinely, measurably better than the version of my life that existed the Wednesday before that Thursday afternoon wire alert, back when I still believed, without evidence, that my family's love for me operated on the same terms as my love for them. I wouldn't have chosen to learn that lesson through a forged deed and a country club arrest. But I learned it, and I built something real and solid and entirely verifiably mine on the other side of it. And if there's a single thing I want you to take from everything I've just told you, it's that the truth, however expensive it is to uncover, is always, in the end, cheaper than the version of your life you'd have to keep building around a lie. Christine's case, the one I mentioned, closes out in about 6 weeks, and I already know from the bank records her sister's attorney reluctantly produced last week that the pattern matches almost exactly what Walter Bishop taught me to look for 2 years ago. Small transfers first, testing whether anyone was watching, then larger ones once the silence held. I told Christine the same thing Ruth told me in that first meeting. Don't call your sister. Bring me every document you have. It's strange. Doing for someone else exactly what was once done for me, standing on the other side of that county clerk's counter now, instead of the side holding the printout, and I think that's the part of this story I didn't expect when I flew home on a red-eye I booked without telling anyone. That the worst thing my family ever did to me would eventually become the exact skill set that lets me stand between other families and the same quiet, patient erosion I almost didn't catch in time myself. Christine asked me one more question before we hung up that call, the same question I'd asked Ruth 2 years earlier, without quite realizing I was asking it. What happens if the evidence points somewhere worse than she's currently prepared for? If the 6-figure inheritance dispute turns out to be the smallest piece of something her sister's been running for years, something that touches their mother's own accounts, their mother's own signature, documents that go back further than either of them have thought to check yet. I didn't have a comfortable answer for her, because I remembered exactly how it felt to ask that same question and not want the real answer, and I told her the only thing I actually know to be true after everything that happened to me. You don't get to decide how deep it goes before you look. You only get to decide whether you're going to look at all. If you've ever had that exact feeling, the cold certainty that you already suspect more than you've let yourself confirm, tell me where in that process you are right now. Because next week I'm walking through exactly how we traced the money in Christine's case. Step by step, the same way Walter once walked me through mine, and I promise you the next thread pulls tighter than anything I've told you today. You already sat through every document, every wire transfer, every notary journal entry in my story without skipping ahead once, which tells me something about the kind of viewer you actually are, the kind who wants the whole paper trail instead of the easy summary. Subscribe now while you're already this far in, because you already know you're not walking away without seeing how Christine's ends. And neither am I.